Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. The ring had always been with him. It was a small thing, nothing flashy, but to Peter, it was the most important piece of jewelry he owned. His wedding ring was a symbol of the love he had for Sarah, his wife of 5 years. It was simple gold with a faint engraving inside that only they knew about. An inside joke, a small reminder of their first date. But one evening, after returning home from work, he noticed it was gone. At first, Peter thought he had simply misplaced it. He checked his pockets, his jacket, the bathroom counter, everywhere he could think of. He retraced his steps. Had he taken it off to wash his hands? No, he hadn't. But when he couldn't find it, he began to feel an uncomfortable knot in his stomach. The more he searched, the more the emptiness in his chest grew. Maybe it fell off somewhere, he muttered to himself. Sarah was in the living room, reading a book, and didn't seem to notice his growing distress. He didn't want to worry her. "I'll find it. It's just a ring." But when he didn't find it by the time dinner rolled around, Peter began to feel the weight of it. Something was wrong. He knew it. He had lost it, and now he couldn't shake the sinking feeling that he had lost something more. "Where is it, Peter?" Sarah asked, looking up from her book. There was concern in her voice now, too, but not for the ring. She could tell something else was on his mind. "You've been looking around like you lost your keys." I can't find my ring," he replied, his voice tight, and he felt the heat rise to his face. She raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "You're acting like it's the end of the world." "It's just a ring, Peter. You'll find it." But he couldn't. No matter how many places he searched, the ring was gone. Sarah helped him look for a while, but eventually she stopped. "It's probably just somewhere you forgot about," she said, trying to soothe him. "Don't stress over it." That night, as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, Peter felt a strange sensation. He kept hearing a soft voice calling his name. "Peter!" It was faint, distant, like a whisper on the wind. He thought it might be Sarah, but when he turned to her, she was sound asleep beside him. The room was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore it, but the voice came again. "Peter!" It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't the wind. It felt wrong. A chill ran down his spine. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling. But she didn't stir. The voice came again, closer this time. "Peter." It was almost a whisper, but there was a strange edge to it, something unsettling. He pulled the blankets over his head, trying to block it out, but it continued. The next morning, Peter decided to take another look for the ring. It wasn't in his jacket, or the drawers, or anywhere he had looked the night before. It had simply disappeared. He asked Sarah again if she had seen it, but she said no, of course. "You've been acting strange," Sarah said, eyeing him carefully. "Maybe you need a break. You're overthinking things." Peter didn't answer her. He knew he had heard the voice, and it was bothering him more than he let on. He told himself it was just stress, but something inside him couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. That night, as he lay in bed again, the voice came. This time it was louder, clearer. "Peter." It seemed to be right next to him, almost in his ear. He jolted up, looking around the dark room. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, but she was still asleep, her breathing even. "Peter." The voice came again, louder, almost pleading. This time, Peter couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed his phone and checked the time, 3:15 a.m. "Sarah, wake up," he shook her gently. She stirred but didn't fully wake. "Sarah, something's wrong." He grabbed her arm, shaking her harder. "Sarah." She finally woke up, her eyes squinting in the darkness. "What's wrong, Peter?" "I keep hearing this voice, calling my name," he said, his voice trembling. It's not you. It's not me. It's something else." She blinked at him in confusion. "Peter, you're scaring me." There's nothing here. It's just a dream or something. Go back to sleep. But Peter couldn't sleep. Not with the voice echoing in his head. I'm going crazy, aren't I? He whispered to himself. I'm hearing things that aren't there. The days passed, and Peter's obsession with the lost ring only grew. He searched every inch of the house, but it was as if it had vanished from existence. The voice calling his name, though, had not stopped. It followed him. In the quiet of the morning, in the stillness of night, it was there calling his name. Peter! The voice grew louder every day. Sarah noticed his behavior changing, but when she asked about it, Peter would just say he was fine. He couldn't tell her the truth, not the way he heard it, not the way it tormented him. He kept it to himself, even as the voice grew stronger, more insistent. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, the voice came again. But this time, it was more than just a whisper. It was like it was in the room with them. Peter! The voice called out again. Sarah froze, looking at him in confusion. Did you hear that? She asked, her voice shaking. Peter's heart raced. It's not you, Sarah. He could barely get the words out. It's the voice again. You're hearing things, Sarah said, shaking her head. There's nothing here. It's just all in your mind. Peter stood up, pacing the room. It's not in my mind. It's real. I know what I heard. Sarah stood up and grabbed his arm, trying to calm him down. Peter, stop. You're scaring me. Just sit down, please. Peter jerked his arm away. I need to find the ring, Sarah. I have to find it. I have to. But the more he searched, the more frantic he became. The voice was always there, always whispering, always following him. Peter! Peter! One night, Peter couldn't take it anymore. He stood in the middle of the living room, shouting, I'm not crazy. I'm not hearing things. Someone's calling me. But Sarah wasn't there. He looked around. She was gone. Sarah, he called out, panic rising in his chest. There was no answer. Peter! The voice came again, soft and haunting, but he knew now. He knew who it was. Peter's heart raced as he turned in every direction, but Sarah was nowhere to be found. The house seemed to close in around him, the air thick with tension. He couldn't understand it. His mind felt foggy, his thoughts scattered. Sarah, he whispered again, his voice shaky. But there was no response. Just the same haunting voice coming from the darkness. Peter! It was as though the house itself was alive, pulsing with the sound of his name. He stepped back, a chill creeping down his spine. The house had always been quiet, comfortable, and warm. But tonight it felt wrong. It felt like it was watching him, like something was lurking in the shadows. The voice, his name, echoed from every corner, each whisper sending a shiver up his spine. He tried to ignore it, but the more he tried, the more it intensified. Peter! It was louder now, almost a cry, but it sounded distant, as though it came from somewhere far away, yet so close at the same time. Desperation clawed at him. He had to find Sarah. He had to get out of here. With trembling hands, he reached for his phone and dialed her number. The phone rang once, twice, and then, just as he was about to give up, it clicked. She picked up. Peter? Her voice was groggy, as though she had just woken up. Sarah! His voice cracked. Where are you? Where did you go? There was silence on the other end of the line, a long pause. And then her voice came through calm, almost too calm. Peter, I'm right here. Why are you panicking? He froze. But I can't find you. You're not here. I've been calling your name. Peter. Her voice cut through, sharp and clear. I've been in bed the whole time. Confusion filled his chest. He could hear her breathing, slow and steady, in the background. It didn't make sense. He'd just seen her leave the room. He was sure of it. I don't understand, he whispered, his mind spinning. I saw you leave. You weren't there anymore. Peter, stop. Sarah's voice was firm now. You're not making any sense. You're scaring me. But the voice, Sarah. It keeps calling my name. I'm not crazy. It's real." His breath came out in ragged gasps. The phone was quiet for a moment, and then Sarah spoke again, her tone a little softer. "Peter, I haven't heard any voice. There's nothing here. I'm right here with you." But he could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, the air growing colder, heavier. He couldn't take it anymore. His hands shook as he hung up the phone. He stared at it for a moment, his thoughts racing. His head throbbed, his eyes darting around the room. The voice, this thing, had to be real. He wasn't imagining it. But if Sarah wasn't gone, if she wasn't calling him, then who, what was? He stepped cautiously toward the hallway, listening carefully for any sound. The house felt like it was closing in on him, the walls pressing tighter with each passing second. Suddenly, he heard a soft creak, a footstep from the other end of the hallway. He froze, staring into the dim light at the far end. "Sarah," he called out again, his voice trembling. No answer. But then he heard it. "Peter." It came again, but this time it was not from the other end of the house. It came from behind him. He spun around so quickly that his heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the dark hallway, was Sarah. But something was wrong. Her eyes were wide, vacant, as though she wasn't really there. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light. "Sarah?" Peter's voice was a whisper. "What's wrong with you?" She didn't respond. She just stared at him, unmoving. His pulse raced. What was going on? Then, in a low voice that sent chills down his spine, she spoke. "Peter, you know what's wrong. You've lost it." The words didn't make sense. What was she saying? Peter took a step toward her, his heart pounding. "What do you mean? What's happening?" But before he could reach her, she vanished. She just disappeared into the darkness. Peter's breath came out in a gasp. His hands were shaking so badly now that he could barely hold himself upright. "Sarah," he cried, but there was no answer. He stumbled back, running down the hallway, checking every room, every closet. But she was gone. And then in the silence, he heard it again. "Peter." The voice was close, so close it was as if it was inside his own head. Peter dropped to his knees, his breath shallow. His hands trembled as he reached for his chest, clutching at the empty space where his wedding ring should have been. He had lost the ring, and now he had lost Sarah too. "Peter." The voice was so close, so clear now, it almost felt like it was coming from inside him. He couldn't escape it. It echoed through his mind, through his soul. He was trapped. And then, the words that had been echoing in his mind all night came together. "You've lost it all." Peter's heart skipped a beat as he realized what the voice was saying. It wasn't just his ring he had lost. It was everything. Everything that had once been real, everything that had once felt like home, was slipping away. His world was unraveling, piece by piece. And he didn't know how to stop it. The ring was gone. But it wasn't just the ring. It was his life, his connection to everything that mattered. It was all slipping through his fingers. "Peter," the voice whispered again. And this time he didn't run. Peter sat in the darkness, his back pressed against the wall. The house was silent now, but the air was thick with something that made it hard to breathe. His heart was pounding in his chest, each beat a reminder that he wasn't alone. The voice, the one that had been calling his name, still echoed in his mind. It had stopped speaking out loud, but the words lingered in his thoughts. He wanted to escape, but something told him that leaving wouldn't make the voice go away. He had to face it. He had to understand what was happening. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, his legs weak and unsteady beneath him. His mind was clouded, thoughts tangled and confusing. He glanced around the darkened hallway, trying to gather his bearings. Where had Sarah gone? Why hadn't she answered? "Peter." The voice came again, but this time it wasn't from behind him. It was right next to him, like a whisper in his ear. He jumped, his body stiff with fear, and spun around. But there was nothing. No one. A cold sweat coated his skin, and his breath hitched in his throat. The voice, it was real. It wasn't his imagination. It was like it was part of him, following him, whispering in his ear when no one was there. "Where are you?" he whispered into the dark, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" But again, there was no answer. The house was still. He stepped cautiously toward the staircase, unsure of what he would find. The stairs creaked beneath his feet, each step a reminder of how wrong everything felt. The quiet stretched on, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, something that knew he was coming. He reached the top of the stairs and hesitated, his hand gripping the banister. Every instinct told him to turn back, to leave. But something kept pulling him forward, as though the house itself was alive and needed him to move, to keep searching. "Peter," the voice said again, this time in a low, almost sorrowful tone. He froze. It sounded like Sarah. Without thinking, he walked toward the bedroom, his legs moving on their own. The door to their room was slightly ajar, and a sliver of pale light flickered from within. The voice came again, louder now, unmistakable. "Peter." His heart skipped a beat as he pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was empty. No Sarah. No sign of her anywhere. Just the quiet, still air. "Where are you?" His voice cracked, desperation creeping into his words. Then, as if answering him, the light from the window flickered, casting a brief shadow across the room. Peter turned toward it, eyes wide with disbelief. On the floor, just a few feet away from where he stood, was the wedding ring. His wedding ring. It gleamed in the dim light, as though it was waiting for him to pick it up. But something wasn't right. The air grew colder as he bent down to retrieve it, the floor creaking beneath his weight. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, and the moment he touched it, the room seemed to pulse with a strange energy. "Peter," the voice called again, and this time it was stronger, as though it came from the walls themselves. He quickly pulled his hand away from the ring, his heart racing. What was happening? Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the walls. Peter spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The air in the room grew thick, like it was pressing in on him from every direction. "Sarah," he called out, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Where are you?" But there was no answer. The voice came again, louder this time, as though it was coming from inside his own head. "Peter," he gasped, his body trembling, and the room seemed to close in around him. The walls seemed to stretch and shift, bending in unnatural ways. It was as if the house itself was alive, twisting and changing, trying to trap him in its grip. He stumbled backward, his back slamming against the wall. His breath came out in ragged gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had to get out, but as he turned to run, the door to the room wouldn't open. It was stuck, frozen in place, as if something on the other side was holding it shut. He pulled at the handle, his hands slick with sweat, but it wouldn't budge. The voice was growing louder now, almost deafening. "Peter, you've lost everything." It was a whisper, but it carried a weight that made it feel like the room itself was speaking. "You're not alone, but you will be." Terror gripped him. What was happening to him? To his mind, he couldn't think straight. The room swirled around him, the walls bending, the floor shifting under his feet. He gasped for air, his hands shaking as he struggled to stay on his feet. And then, through the chaos, he saw her. Sarah. She stood at the far end of the room, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her face was pale, like she had seen something unimaginable. "Sarah," Peter whispered, his voice raw. But she didn't respond. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Peter," she said, her voice low, almost a chant. "It's too late now." Peter's breath caught in his throat. His mind was spinning, everything twisting in on itself. No, Sarah, what's happening? Please tell me." But Sarah didn't speak. She just continued to walk toward him, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her eyes fixed on him. Peter stepped back, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He couldn't escape. He was trapped. And the voice, it was everywhere now, inside his mind, inside his soul. Peter, you've lost everything. Peter's heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last, the sound reverberating through his ears. His feet felt heavy as if the floor itself was trying to hold him in place. He watched Sarah take another step forward, her face expressionless, her eyes void of recognition. "Sarah, please," Peter pleaded, his voice breaking, his throat raw. "You have to help me. What is this? What's happening?" His words were lost in the oppressive weight of the room, swallowed by the thick air that seemed to push against him. She stopped just a few feet away, her presence casting a chilling shadow in the dim light. Peter's pulse quickened as she stared at him, her lips parting slightly, as if she were about to speak. But instead, she merely stood there, the silence growing heavier by the second. Then, with a sudden movement, her hand reached up to touch the ring on her finger. The same ring. His ring. The one he had lost. Peter's breath caught in his throat. It was as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, for him to understand something he didn't yet see. "You've forgotten," Sarah whispered, her voice hollow, distant, as if it came from far beyond her own body. "You lost it, Peter. You lost everything, and now it's all coming for you." His mind raced. Lost everything? What did she mean? The words felt like a fog, thick and confusing. He couldn't make sense of them, couldn't grasp them. The darkness in the room seemed to grow, reaching out like tendrils, creeping into his mind. "Sarah, please." Peter's voice faltered. "What are you talking about?" Sarah didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand, and the ring glimmered in the dim light, catching Peter's gaze. It seemed to shimmer with a strange, unsettling energy. It wasn't the same ring he had known, the one he had worn for years. This one felt different, as if it carried with it the weight of something ancient, something malevolent. The air grew colder still, the temperature dropping rapidly, as if the very essence of the house had turned against him. His breath fogged in front of him, each exhale a visible reminder of the growing fear that consumed him. And then he heard it again. "Peter!" The voice, so familiar yet alien, called out again, but this time it wasn't from Sarah. It wasn't even from the house. It was a voice from somewhere deep within him, something that was both his own and not at all his own. He spun around, his eyes wild, trying to find the source, but the room seemed to shift and bend, distorting everything he saw. The walls pressed in tighter, and the shadows twisted, pulling at the edges of his mind. "No!" Peter shouted, gripping his head in his hands, his nails digging into his scalp. "Stop! What is this? What do you want from me?" The voice continued, growing louder, as though it was all around him now, in his mind, in the very air he breathed. "You've lost everything, Peter. You're the one who called me. You're the one who opened the door." The floor beneath him seemed to tremble, and a low, guttural sound echoed through the room, something that made his skin crawl. The voice grew more frantic, more demanding, and Peter felt as if the walls were closing in on him, trapping him in the very nightmare that had begun when he first lost the ring. "Please," he screamed, his voice breaking. "What did I do? What door did I open?" But the voice didn't answer. It simply echoed in his mind, relentless and deafening, until it felt as though the sound was tearing him apart from the inside out. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, clutching his head, trying to block out the noise, but it only grew louder, more insistent. The ring. He had to focus on the ring. The cold metal had been in his hand moments ago, but now, as he looked around the room, it was gone. The floor was bare. The shadows that had seemed to reach for him now appeared to be laughing, their twisted shapes mocking him. "Sarah!" he gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. "Please, tell me what's happening. What did I do?" The sound of his own voice seemed to pierce the silence for a brief moment, but the shadows only swirled tighter, their tendrils reaching out for him. He felt a cold, clammy hand brush against his shoulder, and his entire body went stiff with terror. He didn't dare look, but the voice came again, only this time it was not just a whisper. It was a a tortured, shrill scream that echoed throughout the house. "You've forgotten, Peter," it howled. "You've lost everything." Peter's breath hitched in his chest as the scream seemed to vibrate through his very bones. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't escape the sound, the pressure that was building around him, tightening, choking him. And then, through the haze of panic, he heard something else. A soft sound like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the darkness. "Peter," the voice repeated, softer now, but filled with an undeniable pain. "It's not too late, not yet." He blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of the jumble of sounds in his head. And there, standing in front of him, was Sarah, her face pale, her eyes wide and full of fear. She was no longer the distant, almost empty figure from before. She was real, present, and trembling. "Sarah?" Peter whispered, his voice hoarse. "Is that really you?" She nodded slowly, her hand trembling as she reached out toward him. "It's not too late," she said again, her voice breaking. "But you have to remember, Peter. You have to remember what you've lost, and why it's calling you." Peter's eyes darted around the room, his heart racing. He had to remember. But what? What had he lost? And why was this happening to him? Then, in the corner of the room, something caught his eye. A shape, half hidden in the shadows, a figure standing just out of view. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end as his eyes locked onto it. It was a figure he had never seen before, but somehow it felt familiar. Peter's heart thudded in his chest, his pulse racing as his gaze fixed on the shadowy figure. His breath came in shallow gasps, the air around him thickening with the scent of something distant, something ancient. The figure remained still, unmoving, yet it felt as though it was slowly drawing closer. "Sarah," Peter whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you see that? What is that?" Sarah's face, once full of fear, now twisted into an expression he couldn't quite place. It was a strange mixture of sadness and understanding, as though she knew something he didn't, a secret he wasn't meant to learn. "You're seeing it now," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, almost lost in the suffocating quiet. "The shadow, it's part of what you've lost. Part of you." Peter's mind reeled. Part of him? What did that mean? He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure in the corner. It seemed to be watching him, its shape more defined now, the outline of a man's form taking shape within the darkness. But something was off. Its presence felt wrong, like it was both part of the room and something entirely separate, something that didn't belong. That's not real," Peter said, shaking his head as though he could will the figure away. "It can't be real." But the figure didn't vanish. It remained there, waiting, its form growing clearer with each passing second. Peter could feel his heart racing faster, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. Something was pulling him toward it, drawing him closer with a force he couldn't resist. The shadows around the figure seemed to move, writhing like tendrils, reaching out with an intent that made Peter's stomach turn. "No, Peter," Sarah whispered, her voice distant. "You need to understand. This is the thing you opened the door for. The thing that's been waiting for you." The figure stepped forward into the dim light, its face still hidden in shadow. Peter's breath caught in his throat as he recognized something familiar in the silhouette. The posture, the way it moved, the shape of the body. But it wasn't right. It couldn't be. His mind was playing tricks on him. "Peter." The figure spoke, its voice cold and hollow, but unmistakably familiar. "You've been searching for me, haven't you?" Peter froze, the words echoing through his mind. He didn't have to ask who the voice belonged to. He already knew. "James?" Peter whispered, his voice barely audible. "Is it really you?" The figure nodded slowly, the movement sharp and deliberate. "I've been waiting, Peter, waiting for you to remember." The room seemed to grow even darker, as though the shadows themselves were pulling the light away. The temperature dropped, and Peter could see his breath in the air, thick and visible like smoke. I don't understand," Peter stammered, his mind racing. "James, what are you talking about? How do you know my name?" The figure stepped closer, and Peter's skin prickled with fear. Every step it took was deliberate, measured. It stopped just in front of Peter, so close now that Peter could feel the cold radiating off of it. The shadows around James began to ripple, almost as if they were alive, pulling the light from the room, leaving them in an ever-deepening darkness. "Because you know me," James said, his voice now a low, guttural growl. "You remember me, don't you?" Peter's pulse raced. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to move. He felt trapped, cornered by a nightmare that he couldn't escape, and the shadow in front of him seemed to grow taller, more oppressive, suffocating him with its presence. "I don't know you," Peter shouted, the words bursting from him in a desperate plea. "I don't know you. I've never seen you before. What are you doing here?" James's eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, seemed to bore into Peter's soul. The shadows around him shifted, and for a moment, Peter swore he saw something in James's face, a hint of recognition, or perhaps something darker. Something vengeful. "You opened the door," James said, his voice now a sinister whisper that seemed to fill the entire room. "You lost your way, Peter. You lost everything, and now you're mine." The room seemed to close in on Peter as the air grew thick with an overwhelming pressure. The walls seemed to pulse, beating in time with his heart, and his head spun. The voice, the one he had been hearing all this time, was now a steady drumbeat in his mind, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. "You opened the door," James repeated, his voice rising to a crescendo. "And now you'll never be free." Peter's eyes locked onto the ring, the one that had started all of this. It lay on the floor at James's feet, gleaming in the dim light, its presence a weight upon his chest. I didn't mean to. I didn't know," Peter gasped, his mind racing to make sense of everything. He felt the walls of the room closing in, the shadows surrounding him, suffocating him. The floor seemed to shift beneath his feet, and for a moment, it felt as though the room itself was alive, twisting and contorting with a hunger that made Peter's skin crawl. "You didn't know," James said, his voice a mockery of sympathy. "But you opened the door, Peter. You called to us, and now you're ours." The last words echoed through Peter's mind like a death knell, and in that moment he understood. The ring. It wasn't just a symbol of love. It was a key to something ancient, something beyond his comprehension, something that he should have never touched. And now it was too late. The shadows closed in tighter, and Peter's vision blurred, the room spinning as the last vestiges of light were swallowed by the darkness. The voices, Sarah's, James's, and the countless others, seemed to merge into one, an unholy chorus of whispers and screams that filled the air, drowning him in sound. And then, as the last remnants of his sanity slipped away, the darkness took him completely. Peter's body felt as though it were being pulled in every direction at once, the darkness suffocating him, choking the very air from his lungs. His mind screamed for freedom, for escape, but it was no use. He was trapped. The floor beneath him no longer felt solid. It had turned into something liquid, flowing like dark water, swallowing him whole. "Peter!" The voice of James called again, but this time, it didn't sound like the man Peter once knew. It was twisted, distorted, full of malice. "You should have never searched. You should have left it alone." The shadows wrapped tighter around him, crawling up his legs, curling around his arms, and pulling him down deeper. Peter gasped, his chest tightening, and he could feel his pulse hammering in his ears. He tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the thick darkness like a weight on his chest. "Sarah," Peter whispered, his voice breaking as he searched for the familiar sound of her voice, the only thing that could pull him back from the edge. "Where are you? Please, help me." But there was no answer, only the suffocating silence, punctuated by the distant whispers of the shadows. Suddenly, something cold touched his hand, sending a shock through his body. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest as the touch grew firmer, like fingers wrapping around his wrist, pulling him deeper into the abyss. Let go of me, Peter shouted, but the words were lost, drowned out by the noise in his head, the dark voices that whispered and hissed from every direction. Let go! The voice of James repeated, a low, mocking growl. This is your fate now, Peter. You opened the door, and now you belong to us. Peter's chest tightened as panic rose within him. He tried to pull away, but the grip on his wrist only tightened, forcing him to his knees. He looked up in desperation, and the dim shape of James loomed before him, his face still hidden in shadow. You're not real, Peter shouted, the words coming out in a strangled cry. You can't be. James's figure tilted its head, as though considering Peter's words. Then a sickening laugh filled the room, cold and sharp. Not real. No, Peter, we're all too real. You can't escape what you've called into existence. With that, the room seemed to shudder, and the darkness around him deepened even further, pressing against him like a physical force. The shadows were alive, shifting and writhing, reaching for him with a hunger he could feel deep in his bones. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure lifted. The grip on his wrist vanished. The voices quieted, and the air around him grew still. Peter blinked, disoriented, as the room slowly came back into focus. The shadows no longer swirled around him, and the oppressive darkness seemed to recede. He was back in his home, standing in the same place where everything had started, but something was different. The room felt wrong in a way that he couldn't explain. It was as though the very fabric of the world around him had been altered, twisted. He looked down at his hand, and the wedding ring was gone. It wasn't just lost, it had vanished, as if it had never been there at all. Sarah? Peter's voice cracked, his throat dry. He called out, his words echoing in the silence of the room. Sarah, where are you? No response. The silence was suffocating, the absence of sound hanging in the air like a weight. It felt as though time itself had frozen, leaving him trapped in this moment, suspended in a nightmare with no end. He stumbled forward, his feet unsteady, his mind a blur of confusion and fear. He needed to find her. He needed to understand what had happened. What had gone wrong? The shadows, the voices, they couldn't have been real. It was impossible. It had to be some kind of trick, a nightmare, a hallucination brought on by his guilt, his fear of losing her. But as he walked through the house calling for her, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting just out of sight. The walls felt like they were closing in again, the air growing colder, and the quiet seemed to press in on him, suffocating him once more. His footsteps echoed in the empty house, each sound stretching out in unnatural length, as though time had slowed, the world around him distorting. Sarah, Peter cried, desperation creeping into his voice. Where are you? The house was still, too still. No answer came, not even the faintest sound of movement. It was as though Sarah had vanished, swallowed up by the same darkness that had taken the ring, that had twisted everything around him. Then, just as Peter reached the stairs, he heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible at first. His name. Peter. His heart skipped a beat. The voice was unmistakable. It was Sarah. Sarah, he whispered, turning quickly, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of her. Where are you? The whisper came again, louder this time, more distinct, though still soft and distant. Peter, I've been waiting for you. It was her voice, but something about it felt wrong. It was hollow, distant, as though she were calling to him from the other side of a great divide. The sound echoed in his mind, sending a chill down his spine. Sarah, please, Peter shouted, his voice breaking. He took a step toward the voice, his heart pounding in his chest. Where are you? What's happening? What is going on? But there was no reply, only the haunting whisper of his name, growing fainter with each passing moment. Peter's mind raced. What was happening to him? What was going on with Sarah? The voice, it wasn't just her. It couldn't be. Something else was happening, something he couldn't understand, something that was beyond him. He closed his eyes, trying to steady himself, trying to make sense of the chaos around him. He took a deep breath and turned to face the hallway, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him. Something wasn't right. The house itself seemed to shift, the walls closing in on him once more. Something was wrong, but he couldn't escape it. Peter's breath came out in shallow gasps, his mind scrambling to piece together the fragments of his thoughts. The air felt thick, each inhalation a struggle against the overwhelming pressure. He couldn't tell if the suffocating silence was a trick of his mind, or if it was something else, something much darker. He forced himself to take another step down the hallway, each footfall sending an unsettling echo through the house. The soft whisper of his name was still there, just barely audible, like a thread barely held on in the silence. His pulse quickened as he approached the source, the sound pulling him forward with an unnatural force. "Sarah," he called again, his voice trembling. He couldn't stop himself from asking, even though deep down he knew she wasn't here. She was gone. "Peter," came the whisper again, so close this time, yet still out of reach. His heart skipped in his chest. It sounded like her, but there was something wrong with the way she spoke, something hollow in her tone, something detached. The hallway stretched on in front of him, longer than it should have been, its darkened corners swallowing the light from the lamps behind him. It felt as though the house itself was alive, breathing, watching him. Peter stepped forward again, his feet dragging with each movement. A low creaking sound filled the air, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight, as though warning him to turn back. But he couldn't. He couldn't stop now. Not with that voice calling him, not with the strange feeling gnawing at him, urging him to find the source. Another step, and then he stopped. Something caught his eye, something shiny, small, and glinting against the floor. His heart leapt into his throat. It was his wedding ring. He bent down quickly, his hands shaking as he picked it up, the cold metal cool against his fingertips. It felt heavier than it should have, like it had been waiting for him, like it had been calling to him all this time. The whispers grew louder as he held the ring, now unmistakable in their tone. "Peter!" He flinched at the sound, his body tensing, but he couldn't stop himself from following it, walking deeper into the hallway. Each step he took seemed to distort the space around him. There was something wrong with the walls, the lights flickering and shifting, casting strange, unsettling shadows that twisted and stretched in unnatural ways. The ring felt heavier in his hand, pulling him forward like an invisible chain. His chest tightened with a new wave of panic. He had to find Sarah. He had to make sense of this, but the house, the shadows, the voice, they were all suffocating him, making it harder and harder to breathe. "Sarah, please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. His hand clutched the ring tighter, as if it would somehow anchor him to reality. But the silence pressed in on him once more, cold and thick. The only sound was his own breath, and then, just when he thought he could bear it no longer, another whisper, louder than the last. "Peter!" It was behind him. He spun around, his heart in his throat, but there was nothing there. Just the endless stretch of the hallway, the walls closing in with each passing second. His mind raced. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But then, he heard it again, much clearer this time. A soft, familiar voice, so close, but still not quite there. "Peter, why did you leave me?" It was Sarah's voice, her words sharp with sorrow. He froze. His blood ran cold. No, this wasn't possible. Sarah couldn't be here. She couldn't be calling him. "Sarah," he whispered, barely able to say the words. "What's happening? Where are you?" There was a long pause before the voice answered again, its tone twisted now, almost pleading. "You've already found me, Peter." Peter's heart hammered in his chest. "No, I haven't," he said, his voice cracking. "I haven't found you. Where are you? What's going on?" The whispers died down, but a low, menacing laughter filled the air in response. It was a laugh that made his skin crawl, as if someone was mocking him, enjoying the torment. Suddenly, the temperature in the hallway dropped, the cold sinking into his bones like ice. He could see his breath now, puffing out in small clouds before him, thick with fear. He turned to the door at the end of the hallway, the only exit he could see. It looked different now, more distant, like the hallway had stretched even farther while he wasn't looking. But he had to get out. He had to find Sarah. He started toward the door, moving faster now, his heart racing. He reached for the handle, but just as his fingers brushed the cold metal, he heard it again, louder this time. "Peter!" The voice echoed down the hallway, but this time it wasn't just Sarah. It was joined by others, voices calling his name, all at once. They blended together into a chorus of desperate whispers, each one indistinguishable from the last. They surrounded him, engulfing him in a cacophony of sound, filling his ears with the sense that he was being consumed, that he was losing himself in the flood of voices. Peter yanked the door open, his eyes wide in terror, but when he stepped into the next room, the world around him didn't make sense. The room was dimly lit, the walls covered in shadows that twisted and writhed like they were alive. And there, standing in the center, was Sarah, or at least what looked like her. She was facing him, her back to the dim light, her hair falling in front of her face, hiding her eyes. But something wasn't right. Her figure seemed wrong. Her posture was stiff, unnatural. The shadows around her seemed to shift and grow, stretching toward him, as if they were alive, hungry. "Sarah?" Peter whispered, taking a cautious step forward, but his voice wavered. She didn't move. Not at first. Then slowly she turned to face him, her eyes, if they were even eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, black as coal. There was nothing but emptiness behind them. "Peter," she said, her voice distant, hollow, echoing in his mind like a distant memory. "You shouldn't have come." Peter's body went cold. This wasn't Sarah. This couldn't be Sarah. Her lips curled into a twisted smile, and the darkness around her seemed to pull in closer, like it was about to consume him. "Sarah," Peter choked out, his throat tight with fear. "Please, what's happening to you?" The smile on her face grew wider, more sinister, and the darkness swirled around her like a vortex. "You already know, Peter." Peter's mind raced, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. The figure in front of him, Sarah, wasn't her. It couldn't be. This thing had the same face, the same voice, but its eyes, those eyes, glowing with an empty blackness, told him everything he needed to know. He stumbled backward, his legs shaking beneath him. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. His heart thundered in his chest, and a cold sweat broke out on his skin. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. The air around him thickened, growing heavy, as if the very room was alive and breathing with malicious intent. The shadows that clung to the walls twisted and writhed like serpents, moving with a mind of their own, pulling toward the figure at the center of the room. "Sarah," he whispered again, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. "What's happened to you? What are you?" She took a step toward him, and with each movement, the room seemed to warp around her, stretching and distorting as though reality itself was bending. The figure that had once been his wife now loomed larger, its features shifting in and out of focus. It was as if she was no longer fully present, as if she was a part of something much darker, much older than he could comprehend. "You shouldn't have looked for me, Peter." The voice, her voice, came again, but it was layered with something else, something ancient and filled with malice. "Now you'll never escape." Peter's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? Where are you? Where did you go?" he pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of his fear. The figure before him tilted its head, a sickeningly slow motion that sent chills down his spine. The smile on her face spread wider, stretching unnaturally as her skin seemed to ripple, like something was crawling beneath it. "I never left you, Peter. You just stopped looking." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Stop looking?" He stumbled backward, his mind grappling with the sudden, terrible realization. Stop looking? But he hadn't stopped looking. He had searched for days. He'd never stopped thinking about her. She had been lost. She had died. She had been gone. But now, in front of him, this thing, this creature that wore her face, was telling him something else. Telling him that she hadn't gone anywhere at all. That she had been here all along. No! Peter's voice barely escaped him, hoarse and weak. You're not Sarah. You can't be. The creature's smile flickered, its eyes burning brighter, and it tilted its head in amusement. I am Sarah, Peter. I am everything you lost. I am the one who's always been with you, and I will never leave. The darkness around her swelled, pressing in on Peter from all sides, filling the room with a suffocating weight. His chest tightened as he fought to breathe. He needed to get out. He needed to leave. But the door, his only escape, had vanished, swallowed up by the walls that seemed to stretch on forever, closing in on him. His hand, still clutching the ring, trembled as he looked down at it. The cold metal seemed to hum with a strange energy, vibrating softly as if it was alive, as if it was calling to him. The laughter, deep and hollow, echoed in the room, and Peter's heart skipped a beat. He looked back up at the creature. It was standing even closer now, its shadow growing longer, swallowing up the space between them. You can't escape, Peter, it said, its voice sweet and venomous. You made the choice the moment you found the ring. You wanted me back, didn't you? You wanted to feel whole again. But you should have known better. You should have known there's always a price. The room seemed to shift again, the walls warping in and out, pulling him further into its grip. The air around him crackled with a sense of dread, and he could feel it in his bones now. This wasn't his wife. This wasn't Sarah. This was something else entirely. Something far worse. He shook his head desperately, trying to clear the fog of fear clouding his thoughts. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't mean to. But the creature with Sarah's face was already laughing again, the sound echoing off the walls, reverberating through his skull. You never mean for it to happen, Peter, it taunted. You never mean for anything, and yet here you are with me. Always with me. You thought you could undo it, fix it, bring her back. But it doesn't work that way. Nothing works that way. Peter's chest tightened further, his heart slamming in his ribcage. His vision blurred. He wanted to scream. He wanted to run. But his legs wouldn't move. The weight of it all, the crushing weight of the room, the impossible weight of the realization, pressed down on him. The creature's eyes gleamed with dark satisfaction. It took another step toward him, its presence suffocating, and Peter could feel the coldness of it seep into his skin. His stomach turned, and for a moment, he felt as though he might collapse right there on the floor. No, he whispered, more to himself than to it. I won't. But the figure that had once been Sarah raised a hand, her fingers now gnarled and elongated, reaching out toward him. Her grip was like iron as it wrapped around his wrist, pulling him closer with terrifying strength. You can't escape, it hissed, its voice now a distorted screech. You're mine now, Peter. The shadows around them closed in, the air thick with darkness. The room seemed to vanish altogether, leaving only the cold, endless void surrounding them. Peter's breath hitched as the dark void closed around him. The creature's grip tightened, its fingers like ice, sending shivers through his entire body. He could feel the life being drained from him with every passing second, as if he were being pulled into some otherworldly abyss. The laughter, now distorted and grating, filled his ears, making his head spin. His heart hammered in his chest, and he struggled against the crushing weight of the shadows that seemed to wrap around him like tendrils. He tried to pull his arm away, but it was no use. The grip was too strong, too unyielding. You'll never escape, the creature hissed, its voice now warped and unnatural. Not from me. Not from what you've done. Peter's mind was racing, his thoughts scattered. What had he done? All he wanted was to get the ring back, to make things right, to bring her back. But now, in the face of this dark, twisted version of his wife, he realized the terrible truth. There was no going back. There was no fixing this. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean any of it, Peter muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Tears burned his eyes as the realization sank in. He had wanted to undo the past, to bring Sarah back from the dead. But some things were never meant to be undone. Some things should never have been tampered with. The creature's face twisted into a grotesque mockery of Sarah's loving smile. You should have known better, Peter. You should have never let go. The shadows pressed in tighter, their cold, suffocating grip choking the air out of him. The room was no longer a room at all. It was a void, a place where time didn't matter, where everything that once felt real was now warped beyond recognition. The walls had faded, the floor had dissolved, and all that remained was darkness. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing voice cut through the haze, a voice that was unmistakably Sarah's. "Peter, Peter, please wake up." The sound was so familiar, so tender, that it made his heart ache with longing. He froze, every muscle in his body locking up as the voice echoed in his ears. It was her. It was Sarah. But before he could respond, the creature's grip tightened even more, dragging him back into the suffocating void. "You're not going anywhere," it snarled. "She's gone. She's been gone for a long time." Peter's mind reeled, but the voice continued to call, soft and desperate. "Peter, Peter, I need you." The sharp contrast between the coldness of the creature and the warmth of Sarah's voice tore at his very soul. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something, a flicker of light in the distance, just beyond the blackened fog. "Sarah," he croaked, his voice barely audible. His body trembled with the effort to speak. "Is it really you? Please, please come back to me." The laughter from the creature echoed louder now, drowning out Sarah's voice. "You're hearing what you want to hear, Peter. You've always been weak. You've always been searching for something that was never there. You can't save her." Peter's head spun, his mind a tangled mess of confusion and despair. The figure of Sarah, the real Sarah, seemed so close, and yet so far away, lost in the thick fog of shadows. But then, a sudden warmth spread through his chest, a warmth that felt like sunlight on his skin. He could hear Sarah's voice again, clearer now, as if it was breaking through the darkness. "Peter, you can save me." His heart skipped a beat. "Save her? I'm not gone," the voice said, a whisper of hope in the midst of the crushing darkness. "You can still save me, but you have to make a choice." The shadows around him seemed to flicker, like they were being pushed back by some unseen force. Peter's mind raced, trying to grasp the meaning of her words. Make a choice? What choice? Was it truly Sarah calling to him? Or was this just another trick, a cruel illusion designed to trap him forever? The creature that had once been Sarah hissed in fury, its face twisting in grotesque anger. "You can't save her. You'll never save her. She's mine now forever." Peter's body trembled as he took a step forward, the warmth of Sarah's voice drawing him toward the light in the distance. I can't leave you like this," he whispered, his throat tight with emotion. "I love you, Sarah. I need you." The creature let out a blood-curdling scream, its eyes burning with rage as the shadows grew darker, thicker, pressing in on Peter. But despite the overwhelming fear that gripped him, a strange sense of determination surged within him. He had to save her. He had to try. Suddenly, he felt a cold breeze against his skin, and the warmth of Sarah's voice filled the space around him, stronger than before. "Peter, I'm here. Please, I'm still here." He reached out into the darkness, feeling for the light that seemed to beckon him forward. As his fingers brushed against the cool, invisible air, he felt something else, something solid, something real. His hand closed around it, and he felt the familiar, comforting weight of the wedding ring. The ring. The same ring he had lost. The same ring he had fought so hard to retrieve. The very symbol of his love for Sarah. But now, in his hand, it felt different. It was warm, pulsing with an energy he couldn't understand. But it was alive, alive in a way that sent shivers down his spine. "Take it," Sarah's voice whispered, close now, so close. "Take it, Peter, and I'll come back. I promise. Peter's heart pounded in his chest as he held the ring tightly in his hand. His breath came in ragged gasps, his entire body trembling with fear and anticipation. This was it. This was the moment. But as he looked into the darkness, the creature's screeching grew louder, drowning out everything else. No, you can't. You won't take her from me. She is mine. The world around him seemed to shudder, as if it were on the brink of collapse. The shadows swirled in every direction, threatening to swallow him whole. But Peter didn't care anymore. He couldn't let go. Not now. He closed his eyes, squeezed the ring in his hand, and whispered, "I choose you, Sarah. I will save you." For a moment, everything went silent. The screaming, the laughter, the crushing darkness, it all stopped. There was a stillness, an eerie calm that seemed to hold its breath. Peter's heart pounded in his chest, his fingers still wrapped around the warm ring. The only sound he could hear was his own shaky breathing, the cold air brushing against his skin, and the distant echo of Sarah's voice, now a whisper. Peter, her voice was soft, gentle, but there was a sadness to it, a quiet sorrow that made his chest tighten. He could feel her presence now, like a faint warmth in the depths of the void, pulling him closer. He opened his eyes and looked around. The shadows had faded, their oppressive weight lifted. The darkness, once suffocating, now seemed distant, like a dream receding. The air around him felt lighter, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his soul. "Sarah," he called out, his voice trembling. For a moment there was nothing, no answer, no sign of her. But then, in the distance, a faint glow appeared. It was soft at first, just a flicker, like a candle's flame dancing in the dark. But it grew slowly, steadily, until it illuminated the space around him. The fog that had once filled the room began to dissipate, replaced by the warm light. And then, through the mist, Peter saw her. She stood there, just beyond the light, her figure ethereal and delicate, like a memory made flesh. Sarah. She was as he remembered, her hair softly falling around her shoulders, her eyes filled with a quiet, infinite sorrow. She didn't speak, but her presence alone was enough to fill the void with an overwhelming sense of love and longing. Peter's heart skipped a beat. "Sarah," his voice cracked, and he took a tentative step forward. "Is it really you? Please, tell me it's really you." Sarah's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, everything else fell away. The fear, the darkness, the weight of the world, they all vanished in the light of her gaze. He reached out, his hand trembling, desperate to touch her, to hold her once more. But before he could move, she raised her hand to stop him. Her expression softened, her lips forming the faintest of smiles. "Peter, you shouldn't have come." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean? I've been searching for you. I've been trying to bring you back." His voice was raw, desperate. "I love you. I need you. Please don't leave me." Tears welled in his eyes as he stepped forward again, but Sarah took a step back. The light around her flickered, and Peter's heart sank. "I know you love me, Peter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But there are things that can't be undone, things that shouldn't be meddled with." Her words were like ice in his veins, but they made sense. He had known it all along. He had tried to undo what had been lost, to reverse the inevitable. And now, standing in front of him, Sarah seemed to carry the weight of that truth. "You shouldn't have done it," she continued, her voice heavy with regret. "You shouldn't have gone looking for me. I don't belong here anymore. I'm not the person you knew." Peter's heart shattered, the truth of her words sinking deep into his soul. "Then what are you? What are you now?" He reached out again, his fingers just brushing the edge of the light. "I'm not yours to save," she said, her voice trembling with an emotion that mirrored his own. "I've become something else, something you can't bring back." The light flickered again, the warmth fading for a split second, and Peter's breath caught. He wanted to shout, to beg, but he knew the truth. She was right. He had done something terrible. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen. I just wanted you back. I didn't know what else to do." Sarah's expression softened, and she took a tentative step toward him, her hand reaching out. "I know, Peter. I know you didn't mean to. But sometimes the price for love is too high." Peter stood frozen, unable to move, watching her, watching the woman he loved, standing before him, yet so far out of reach. She was slipping away, and he felt it in every inch of his being. The very air around him seemed to pulse with the loss, with the finality of it all. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't lose you. Not like this." But as he spoke, the light began to flicker once more, growing dimmer. Sarah's figure blurred, becoming less solid, fading back into the mist. "Goodbye, Peter," she said softly, the words almost lost in the growing darkness. "I'll always love you." And then, with a final breath, the light went out. The room was plunged back into darkness, the oppressive weight of the shadows returning, pressing in from all sides. Peter stood frozen, staring into the void, his heart racing, his body trembling. He was alone. Her voice was gone. The warmth that had filled the air had vanished. The ring in his hand grew cold, its once vibrant warmth fading into nothingness. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice trembling with a grief he couldn't express. There was no answer, only silence, and in the distance the faintest sound, a whisper, began to echo once more. It was his name, soft and distant, but unmistakable. Peter. But it wasn't Sarah. It was something else. The shadows shifted, their shapes twisting and warping, and Peter knew, deep in his bones, that he had made a terrible mistake. He had opened the door to something far worse than he could have imagined. And now, there was no going back. The whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. The voice was different now, distorted, hollow, like something that had been dragged from the depths of darkness. Peter's heart pounded in his chest as the sound wrapped itself around him, pulling him deeper into the shadows. "Peter," the voice crooned, a sickly, twisted version of Sarah's tone. It was as if her voice had been corrupted, twisted into something unrecognizable. "Peter." He stumbled backward, his hands still clutching the cold ring. His breath came in short, sharp gasps. The walls seemed to press in on him, the room growing smaller, suffocating. He turned his head wildly, trying to find the source of the voice, but the shadows around him seemed to shift and stretch, refusing to reveal anything. Who are you?" Peter shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The whisper stopped. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. His mind raced as he fought to make sense of everything. The darkness had returned, but it felt different now. More alive, like it was waiting for something. Waiting for him to do something. And then he heard it. A soft click. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the sound of a door opening, but it was there, undeniable. His eyes darted to the far corner of the room, where a small, forgotten door stood ajar. He hadn't noticed it before. It wasn't there earlier. Or perhaps it had always been there, and he had simply failed to see it. The whispering resumed, but this time it was not from behind him. It came from the door. "Come closer, Peter," the voice taunted, its tone now cruel and mocking. "Come find me." The door creaked, its hinges groaning in protest, as if the very structure of the room was alive, waking up to something far more sinister than he could ever imagine. Peter felt an overwhelming urge to run, to escape, but something inside him, the same desperate, foolish part of him, pulled him toward it. Against his better judgment, he moved forward. The floor beneath his feet creaked and groaned with each step, the sound echoing in the silence. As he reached the door, he hesitated, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold, weathered wood. It felt like the door was waiting for him, as if it had been calling to him all along. Peter took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His heart was hammering in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He had to see what was on the other side, had to know what was calling him. He pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything he had seen before. It was vast, larger than the house itself, stretching out into an endless abyss. The walls were lined with strange, ancient symbols carved deep into the stone, their meanings lost to time. A cold wind blew through the room, carrying with it the faintest scent of decay. And there, standing in the center of the room, was a figure that looked like Sarah. But it wasn't her. Not entirely. The woman before him was pale, her skin an unnatural shade of white, her eyes dark and hollow, empty pits where once there had been warmth. Her lips were twisted into a smile, too wide, too sharp. Her once beautiful features were now contorted, like a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. Peter felt the floor beneath him tremble. The air grew thick with a pressure that seemed to push in on him from all sides. His breath caught in his throat as the figure reached out, her long fingers brushing against the air like they were searching for something. Or someone. "Peter," she whispered again, but it wasn't Sarah's voice. It was a grotesque mockery of it, layered with layers of other voices, all twisted together in a symphony of despair. "I've been waiting for you." He tried to step back, but his feet wouldn't move. His body was frozen, rooted to the spot by a force beyond his control. The woman, if that's what she was, took a step toward him, and with every step she took, the shadows around them seemed to grow, spreading like an infection, curling and writhing as if they were alive. I don't understand," Peter stammered, his voice breaking. "Who are you?" The figure smiled again, that horrible, stretching grin. "You already know, Peter." Her voice was cold, and the air around him seemed to thicken. "I am what was born of your mistake." Peter's heart pounded in his chest, his mind struggling to comprehend her words. What mistake? What was she talking about? Then it hit him. The ring. The wish. The price he had paid. The price they had all paid. You're the thing I brought back," he whispered, his voice trembling with realization. "You're the thing I shouldn't have found." The figure nodded slowly, her grin widening. "Yes, you called me. You wanted me. And now I'm here." Her voice dropped to a rasping whisper. "And I'm never leaving." The shadows pressed in, growing heavier, swallowing the space around him. Peter's breath came in ragged gasps as the air thickened, suffocating him. The walls closed in, the symbols on them glowing faintly, pulsating with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. And then, the whispers started again. Not one, but many, hundreds, thousands, layered upon each other, calling his name. "Peter! Peter! Peter!" His vision blurred as the shadows consumed him, the room spinning, the darkness suffocating, and the twisted figure of Sarah, no, whatever it was, looming before him, her laughter rising above the cacophony. "Peter, come back to me!" And with that final whisper, the room was swallowed whole, and Peter was lost forever in the dark, in the void that he had unleashed. The air around Peter became heavy, his chest tightening as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. He couldn't breathe. His vision was blurring, everything spinning. He tried to move, to run, but his legs refused to obey. The shadows were swallowing him whole, pulling him deeper into their embrace. The figure of Sarah, no, whatever she had become, loomed closer, her distorted grin stretching wider with each passing moment. Her hollow eyes burned into him, filled with nothing but emptiness. She was everywhere, her voice now a chorus of hundreds, thousands, overlapping in a maddening cacophony. "Peter! Peter! Peter!" It was endless. Her voice echoed inside his skull, reverberating in the very core of his being. He wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. The room felt like it was collapsing around him, the walls warping and bending as the shadows took on a life of their own. The last thing he saw was her reaching for him, her fingers like claws, and then everything went black. When Peter opened his eyes again, he wasn't sure where he was. The darkness around him was thick and suffocating, but it didn't feel like he was in the room with the twisted figure anymore. He was lying on the floor, cold and damp, the air around him stale. He tried to move but couldn't. His body felt like it was made of lead, too heavy to lift. A strange pressure weighed down on him, pressing him into the floor. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as the memories of what had happened rushed back. The whispers, the figure, the door. "Peter!" It was Sarah's voice, but it wasn't the same as before. It was soft, gentle, like a warm embrace. "Peter, are you okay?" He gasped and opened his eyes again. There, standing above him, was Sarah. She looked normal. No twisted grin, no hollow eyes. She was the woman he had married, the woman he had loved. But something felt wrong. The air was still thick, the shadows still clinging to the edges of his vision. The weight on his chest hadn't lifted. I don't understand," Peter whispered, trying to sit up but failing. I thought." Sarah knelt beside him, her eyes filled with concern. "You were dreaming, Peter. You had a bad dream. It's okay now. You're safe." Peter's heart slowed as he tried to make sense of everything. A dream? It had felt so real. The shadows, the figure, the whispers. But how could it have been a dream? I lost the ring," he muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for his finger. It was bare, just as he remembered. It was here. I lost it. And then I heard you." Sarah gave him a soft smile. "The ring's not important, Peter. You're with me. That's all that matters." But Peter couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The pressure in the air, the shadows in the corners of the room, the lingering whispers. "Sarah, what's happening?" His voice trembled. I can't shake it." The voices, the shadows. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression softening. "It's okay, Peter. It was just a bad dream. The past is gone. We're here, together. That's all that matters." But Peter wasn't so sure. The shadows were still there, just out of reach. And deep down, he knew that whatever had been unleashed, whatever had been waiting in the darkness, was far from over. The days that followed were strange. Peter tried to move on, to go back to normal, but it wasn't easy. The whispers never fully left him. Every corner of the house seemed to have an echo, a lingering presence. At night, he could still hear that voice, soft, faint, calling his name. Peter. It was always just out of reach, just barely there. He would search the house, convinced that something was wrong, convinced that the shadows were waiting for him. But Sarah would always reassure him, her gentle voice soothing him. "You're just tired, Peter. You need rest." But Peter couldn't rest. Something had shifted. Something had followed him back. One evening, after another restless night, Peter stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom, his fingers trembling as they traced the faintest outline of the ring. He hadn't realized it before, but now the absence of it seemed to gnaw at him. The strange weight on his chest, the whispers, the figure, everything felt so close, so impossible to escape. And then he saw it, a small mark on his finger, a faint, dark scar in the shape of the ring, as if it had never truly left him. He gasped, his breath catching in his throat. "It's back," he whispered, his voice shaky. "It's still here." Behind him, Sarah's voice echoed softly, too softly. "Peter." But this time, it wasn't Sarah's voice. It was the voice that had been calling to him. The twisted, corrupted voice. He turned slowly, dread crawling up his spine. The room was empty. But the whispers? They never stopped. Peter never spoke of what happened after that night. He couldn't. The darkness had swallowed him whole, and the ring, the thing he had called back, was now a part of him. Forever. And every night, as he lay in bed, Sarah's voice would whisper in the dark, "Peter, come back to me." But Peter had learned the truth. Some things are better left lost. Some things are better left buried. And the ring? It would never come off. Let's start with the next story. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the empty document on his laptop screen. His hands hovered over the keyboard, but no words came to him. The ticking clock on the wall reminded him that time was slipping away. Midnight had come and gone, and the house was eerily silent. He had completely forgotten about his history paper. It was due first thing in the morning, and his teacher, Mr. Grayson, was not the type to accept late work. Ethan sighed, rubbing his tired eyes. He had no choice but to stay up and finish it. His fingers moved across the keyboard, typing the first sentence. The dim glow of the screen cast long shadows across the room. The only sound was the soft tapping of his keys. Somewhere in the house, the wind howled through the trees outside, rattling the windows. Ethan ignored it, too focused on his work. He had barely written a paragraph when he heard it. A faint clicking sound. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as he continued typing, the sound persisted. It was rhythmic, steady, almost identical to the sound of his own typing. He paused. Silence. Ethan turned his head toward his bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, and beyond it lay the dark hallway leading to the rest of the house. His parents were asleep down the hall. His younger sister, Emily, had gone to bed hours ago. He shook his head and went back to his paper. Tap, tap, tap. The sound returned, louder this time. Ethan stopped typing again. His stomach twisted into a knot. He wasn't imagining it. The sound was coming from the next room, his father's office. But that was impossible. His father wasn't working tonight. His father wasn't even home. He was away on a business trip. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He stood up slowly, his chair creaking as he pushed it back. Carefully, he stepped toward the door, peeking into the hallway. The office door was closed, but he could still hear it. Tap, tap, tap. Someone was typing. Ethan's throat tightened. He took a deep breath and crept toward the office. With a shaky hand, he turned the doorknob and pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The room was dark. The desk lamp was off, and the computer screen was black. But the sound was still there. Tap, tap, tap. Ethan flipped the light switch. The room lit up instantly, revealing nothing but an empty desk. The keyboard sat untouched. The chair was neatly tucked in. But the sound was gone. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He hesitated before stepping inside, looking around. There was nothing unusual. No sign that anyone had been there. Just as he turned to leave, his laptop chimed from his bedroom. A single notification. New document created. Ethan's hands trembled as he hurried back to his room. He sat down and stared at the screen. A new document was open. But he hadn't made it. And there, on the screen, words were appearing. One letter at a time. Tap, tap, tap. Did you forget about me? Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but he didn't dare touch it. The words on the screen were typing themselves. Did you forget about me? His hands clenched into fists. His mind raced for a logical explanation. A virus? A hacker? Maybe his sister was playing a prank. But deep down, he knew none of that made sense. Slowly, he reached for the mouse and tried to close the document. The cursor moved over the X in the corner. Tap, tap, tap. New words appeared. Don't close me. Ethan's body stiffened. The screen flickered for a moment before stabilizing. The room suddenly felt colder, and a strange pressure settled in the air, like someone was standing behind him. His eyes darted toward the hallway. The office door was still open, revealing nothing but darkness. A part of him wanted to run to his parents' room, wake them up, tell them something was wrong. But he knew they wouldn't believe him. He barely believed it himself. Swallowing hard, he turned back to the screen and, against his better judgment, placed his fingers on the keyboard. He hesitated before typing. Who are you? For a moment, there was nothing. The screen remained still. Then, letter by letter, the response appeared. You know me. Ethan's pulse quickened. His mouth felt dry. No, I don't. Yes, you do. The words formed faster now, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other end was growing impatient. You left me here. You forgot about me. But I never forgot you. Ethan's head spun. What was this thing talking about? He tried to think. Had he ever messed with an old file? An abandoned project? Deleted something he shouldn't have? Nothing came to mind. A sudden gust of wind rattled his window, making him jump. The curtains swayed slightly, though the window was shut tight. The air in the room felt heavier now. The dim glow of the laptop screen barely reached the corners of his bedroom. Then, before he could react, his fingers moved on their own. Tap, tap, tap. He wasn't typing, but his hands were. A shiver ran down his spine as he watched the words appear on the screen. Let me in. His chair rolled back as he yanked his hands away. He stared at them, his fingers trembling. He hadn't moved them, he was sure of it. But something had. His laptop screen flickered again, the glow pulsing like a heartbeat. Then, a new line appeared. I'm coming in anyway. A sharp creak echoed through the house. The office chair in the next room scraped against the floor. Ethan's breath hitched. Something was moving in there. Something was getting up, and it was coming toward him. Ethan's stomach twisted as he stared at the hallway. The office door was still open, just a dark void beyond his bedroom light. But he knew something was in there. The chair had moved. He had heard it. His pulse pounded in his ears as he forced himself to listen. The house was silent now, but not the kind of silence that felt empty. It was the kind that felt full, like something was waiting. Then, tap, tap, tap. The sound of typing. Ethan turned back to his laptop. New words were appearing. I see you. His breath hitched. His eyes flicked back to the hallway. Was it standing there? Watching him? He reached out with a shaking hand and slammed his laptop shut. The sound echoed in the quiet room, but the typing didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the office now. Ethan's body locked up. He wanted to run, to wake his parents, to turn on every light in the house. But his legs wouldn't move. The typing grew louder, faster. Then it stopped. A sharp creak followed, like someone shifting their weight. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway. Ethan shot up from his chair, heart slamming against his ribs. His laptop screen flickered on again, despite being shut. The glow cast a faint light over his room, but he didn't dare look at it. He had to move. Now, he bolted for his door and reached for the handle. Click. The door slammed shut on its own. He yelped and yanked at it, but it wouldn't budge. The footsteps stopped just outside his door. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a whisper. So close to the door it might as well have been inside the room with him. Let me in. Ethan's body shook. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to wake up from whatever nightmare this was. Then the voice changed. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was his own voice. Ethan opened the door. His eyes flew open. Ethan opened the door. The voice was identical to his, every inflection, every breath. It sounded like him, but it wasn't. He pressed his back against the wall, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Ethan opened the door. The voice wasn't pleading. It wasn't angry. It was smiling. And then, tap, tap, tap. The typing had started again. His laptop screen flickered brighter, illuminating the room just enough for him to see something in the reflection. Not his own. Something standing behind him. Something grinning. Something reaching for him. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath and spun around, but nothing. The room was empty. His pulse pounded in his ears as he backed away from the wall, his gaze darting from the laptop to the door to the darkened hallway beyond. His skin was ice cold, his fingers trembling. The typing stopped again. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his eyes toward the laptop. The screen glowed in the dim room, its eerie light reflecting off his wide-eyed face. More words had appeared. You're almost done. Ethan's chest tightened. His homework. This had started with his homework. The forgotten assignment, the guilt, the panic. Was that why this was happening? No, that didn't make sense. This was something else. Something worse. A soft creak echoed from the hallway, pulling his attention back to the door. His breath hitched. The shadow beneath the door had changed. It wasn't just standing there anymore. It was shifting, growing. And then, the doorknob rattled. Ethan yelped, scrambling back. Click, click, click. The sound was deliberate. Something was testing the lock. Then the voice came again. Let me in, Ethan. His own voice. But it was wrong. It was too smooth, too controlled. Like someone trying to mimic him, but missing the natural imperfections. Ethan squeezed his hands over his ears. No, 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 he whispered to himself, trying to drown it out. The voice didn't stop. Ethan, let me in. A slow, crawling pressure built behind his eyes. It felt like something was inside his head, pushing against his skull, trying to get in. The typing resumed. He gasped and turned back to the laptop, desperate, needing answers. The words were appearing rapidly now, letter by letter, as if an invisible force was hammering at the keys. You don't have much time. Ethan's fingers twitched. He hesitated, then against every ounce of fear in his body, he reached for the keyboard. His fingers hovered over the keys. He typed, "Who are you?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the reply appeared instantly, as if it had been waiting for him to ask. "I am the one who finishes what you start." Ethan's stomach lurched. The typing continued. "You forgot your homework. So I helped. But now, I need something in return." Ethan's breath turned shallow. The words appeared faster. "A trade. A deal. I finish your work, and you let me in." The last words hit like a punch to the gut. The doorknob twisted sharply. The lock popped open. Ethan barely had time to react before the door began to creak inward. He didn't move. He couldn't. The darkness beyond the doorway stretched, deep and endless, like a gaping mouth. And something inside it was stepping through. Ethan's entire body locked up. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as the door creaked open, revealing the yawning darkness beyond. The dim glow from his laptop screen barely reached the hallway, but he could see it. Something was there. A shape. A figure. It was stepping forward, slowly, deliberately. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as the air in the room grew thick and suffocating. He tried to move, to scream, to do anything, but his body wouldn't respond. The figure emerged, and Ethan's stomach turned to ice. It was him, or almost him. The thing in the doorway had his face, his posture, his hair, even the same clothes he was wearing. But the details were off, just slightly. The skin was too smooth, too stretched, like a mannequin wearing a mask of his own face. The eyes, his own eyes, were too dark, too deep, too empty. And then the worst part, it smiled. A slow, creeping smile that stretched wider than it should have. "I finished your homework, Ethan," it said in his own voice. Ethan's stomach twisted violently. He stumbled backward, his legs finally obeying him, his hands gripping the edge of his desk for support. No, this isn't real," he choked out. The figure didn't blink. It just tilted its head. "I did what you couldn't," it said smoothly. The laptop screen flickered. Ethan's eyes darted toward it. His essay, the one he had been struggling to finish, was now complete. Every line, every paragraph formatted perfectly, his name at the top. But something was wrong. The last sentence. It read, "And now the door is open." Ethan's blood ran cold. He turned back to the figure, his copy, but it was already moving. Stepping inside. The moment it crossed the threshold, a wave of nausea hit Ethan. It felt like something was being pulled from him. A sharp, wrenching sensation, as if invisible hands were reaching into his chest, his mind, his very existence, and dragging it away. The figure's face twitched, almost like it was adjusting, like it was settling into place. "You don't need to do anything anymore, Ethan," it murmured. Its voice was softer now, calmer. "I'll take care of everything." Ethan's vision blurred. His body felt heavy, his thoughts sluggish. His copy reached out a hand. "Let me take your place." Ethan's breath hitched. He could feel it happening, his body, his identity, his reality, slipping away. He was fading, and his copy was becoming more real. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure smiled wider. "Go to sleep, Ethan." The room spun. Everything collapsed into darkness. Ethan's body felt weightless, drifting in an abyss of silence. His mind clawed for reality, for something, but everything was slipping through his fingers like sand. No light, no sound, only a feeling, a terrible, sinking absence. Then suddenly, a gasp. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was sitting at his desk. His laptop screen cast a soft glow over his hands. The document was open, the completed essay still there, its final sentence staring at him. And now the door is open. His fingers twitched. His breath came fast and shallow. His room looked normal, his bed unmade, his bookshelf leaning slightly to the left, his backpack slumped against the chair. But something was wrong. His chest tightened as a thought crawled into his mind, slow and suffocating. Hadn't something just happened? The memory was slippery, like trying to hold water in his hands. The typing, the figure, himself. Ethan swallowed hard and turned his head toward the door. It was open. A sharp jolt of fear ran through him. He didn't remember opening it. The hallway beyond was dark, stretching into shadow. His parents' room was down the hall, but suddenly, it felt impossibly far away. A noise, a clicking sound, typing. Ethan's stomach twisted. It was coming from the next room, his brother's old bedroom. The one that had been empty for over a year, ever since Ryan left for college. No one should be in there. Ethan stood up slowly. His legs felt weak, his movements unsteady. He crept toward the hallway, every step too loud, his breath too sharp in the silence. The typing continued. A steady, rhythmic click-clack, click-clack. Ethan reached the doorway. His fingers hovered over the handle. He didn't want to open it. He had to open it. His trembling hand pressed against the wood, and with one slow push, the door swung open. The room was dark, the only illumination coming from a faint glow in the corner. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. A laptop, sitting on Ryan's old desk. Its screen was on, and the keyboard was moving by itself. Keys pressing down, one after another, as invisible fingers typed line after line. Ethan stepped closer, his pulse hammering in his ears. He leaned forward, his eyes scanning the words appearing on the screen. His own essay. The words were the same, but they were changing. New sentences forming. You shouldn't be here. You don't belong anymore. He is awake now. Ethan's breath hitched. The typing stopped. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Behind him. "I told you to go to sleep, Ethan." Ethan turned slowly. And there, standing in the doorway, blocking the only way out, was himself, smiling. Ethan couldn't move. The figure in the doorway, his own self, stood there smiling. It wasn't a normal smile. It was stretched too wide, too forced, like it didn't quite fit the face. Like someone had worn his skin and hadn't figured out how to use it properly. "I told you to go to sleep, Ethan," the thing said again, in his exact voice. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. His body refused to obey him. His mind screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The thing took a step forward. Ethan mirrored it, backward. His heel hit the edge of the desk. The glow of the laptop screen flickered, casting shifting shadows over the walls. "You're not real," Ethan whispered. The figure's head tilted. Crack. The sound was wet, unnatural, as though bones inside were snapping into place. "Aren't I?" it asked. Then it lunged. Ethan barely had time to react. He threw himself sideways, crashing into the bookshelf. Books tumbled around him as the air filled with the sound of a sharp screech. Not human, not animal, something wrong. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding. His other self was already standing again, its face twisted with something between amusement and hunger. "You shouldn't be here anymore, Ethan." The lights flickered. The walls shivered. Something was changing, warping. The room no longer felt like his brother's. It felt like something else. Something that had been waiting. The laptop screen blinked. New words appeared, typed by unseen hands. "Time's up." The thing lunged again. Ethan ran. He didn't think. He just moved, barreling past the figure, shoving through the doorway, sprinting down the hall. The air around him felt thick, heavy, like pushing through water. His bedroom door was open. He dove inside, slamming it shut behind him. His back pressed against the wood, his chest heaving. Silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, tap. A single slow knock. Tap. Tap. Ethan clenched his eyes shut. The knock came again, louder this time. More insistent. "Ethan," the voice whispered from the other side. "Let me in." Ethan's hand hovered over the lock. His fingers trembled. Then, his laptop screen flickered. The document was still open. New words appeared, one letter at a time. "Don't open the door." Ethan swallowed. The knocking stopped. The silence stretched. Then, the doorknob began to turn. Ethan grabbed the chair from his desk and shoved it under the doorknob, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The knob kept turning, slowly, deliberately. "Ethan," the voice called again, soft and sing-song. It was his voice, but wrong. Stretched, twisted. Then, bang. The door shook. Ethan flinched. His hands clenched into fists. Bang, bang, bang. The force rattled the walls, sent books tumbling off his shelves. Then silence. Ethan stood frozen, his heartbeat crashing in his ears. His eyes darted to the laptop screen. More words had appeared. "It's inside." Cold dread spilled through him. No, it wasn't. He was alone. The door was locked. "Check your closet." Ethan's breath hitched. Slowly, his head turned toward the closet door. It was slightly open. Not much. Just enough for a sliver of darkness to show between the doorframe. That wasn't right. He always kept it shut. He stared, unable to move. His body screamed at him to run. But where? The hallway? The thing was out there. Or was it? His gaze flicked back to the door. Had he heard it leave? The air felt wrong. Thicker. Like something unseen watched him, just beyond the edge of his vision. The closet door creaked. Ethan's stomach dropped. Something inside was breathing. Shallow. Slow. Waiting. The laptop screen flickered. New words appeared. "Don't look." His chest tightened. Then, a long, thin hand slid from the crack in the closet door. It was his hand, but it wasn't. The fingers were too long, the nails blackened, curled slightly like claws. Slowly, it pressed against the wood, pushing the door open inch by inch. Ethan backed up, his legs shaking. "Ethan," his own voice whispered from inside the closet. "Let me help you." The door inched wider. A face began to emerge. It was his face, but stretched, its eyes hollow, dark holes staring at him, unblinking. A smile carved two wide split across its lips. "You forgot your homework." Ethan's scream stuck in his throat. The laptop screen flickered. One final message appeared. "Run." Ethan stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The thing in the closet smiled wider, its two thin lips pulling back to reveal his own teeth. But they were wrong. Jagged. Too sharp. "You forgot your homework," it repeated, the voice stretching unnaturally, like an old cassette tape playing at the wrong speed. The closet door creaked open further. The hand that had emerged now gripped the frame, its fingers pressing into the wood hard enough to make a faint scratching sound. Then, it stepped out. Ethan ran. He dove for the door, yanking the chair away and twisting the knob so fast his wrist burned. The door flew open, slamming against the wall. He bolted into the hallway. The lights flickered, casting long, warped shadows against the walls. The hallway felt wrong, too long, stretching impossibly as if the house itself was warping around him. Behind him, footsteps followed, not rushed, not stumbling, steady, calm, certain. Ethan, his own voice called from the darkness. You can't leave. Ethan didn't listen. He sprinted, his socks slipping against the hardwood as he turned toward the stairs. His only thought, get out. Get out. Then, a second set of footsteps. Faster, heavier. From in front of him, Ethan's stomach twisted. He skidded to a stop at the top of the stairs. Someone stood at the bottom. No, not someone. Him. His own reflection, staring up at him with blank, hollow eyes. Where are you going? It asked, tilting its head in a slow, unnatural motion. Ethan's body locked up. His mind screamed at him to wake up, wake up, wake up, but this wasn't a dream. His other self took a step onto the first stair, then the second, then the third. It was coming up. Ethan spun around. The hallway stretched into nothingness, the doors to every room wide open, revealing only darkness beyond. The footsteps behind him grew closer. He had nowhere to go. Then, the laptop in his bedroom screen flickered to life again. A message typed itself. Jump. His blood turned to ice. Jump. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. Another message appeared. It's not real. The thing was right behind him. Its breath was warm against his neck. Jump. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. And he jumped. Ethan's stomach lurched as he fell. For a split second, he braced for the impact, the bone-shattering pain of hitting the floor at the bottom of the stairs. But it never came. Instead, he plunged into darkness. The air around him felt thick, pressing in on all sides like he had fallen into deep water. His limbs felt heavy. His breathing slowed. The sound of typing filled his ears. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He wasn't falling anymore. He was sitting at a desk. His laptop was in front of him, the dim glow of the screen casting eerie shadows across his hands. His fingers hovered above the keyboard. He was back in his room. His heart pounded. No, this isn't right. The desk was identical to his, but the wood felt wrong beneath his fingertips, too smooth, too cold. He glanced around. The room was empty. The walls were there. The furniture was there. But something was missing. The door. There was no door. No closet. No hallway. No window. Just him. And the laptop. The screen flickered. A message began to type itself. Finish your homework. Ethan's hands moved on their own. His fingers twitched, then pressed down on the keyboard, typing letters, words, sentences. He wasn't in control. Stop, he whispered. His fingers kept typing. I don't want to, he said, louder this time. His hands did not stop. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. A new message appeared on the screen. You don't have a choice. Ethan's breath hitched. Let me go, he whispered. Another message. You belong here now. The walls pressed in closer. The laptop whirred louder. Ethan's own reflection stared back at him from the darkened screen. It smiled. A final message appeared. You forgot your homework. Now you are the homework. Ethan screamed, and the typing never stopped. Let's start with the next story. Ethan groaned as he rolled over, his body heavy with exhaustion. He had set his alarm for 6:30 a.m., just like he always did. The meeting was at 8 o'clock, and he had planned everything. Wake up, shower, grab a coffee, and be out the door by 7:15. But when he blinked at the clock on his nightstand, his stomach dropped. 10:47 a.m. No. He sat up so fast his head spun. He fumbled for his phone. gripping it with shaking hands. The screen showed dozens of missed calls, frantic messages from his boss, and a notification. Alarm, 6:30 a.m. missed. His throat tightened. He never missed alarms. He was a light sleeper, always waking up at the first buzz. But now he had slept straight through, as if the alarm had never gone off at all. He tapped the alarm app, double-checking. It was still set, the volume at max, the ringer set to vibrate, everything exactly as it should be. So why hadn't he heard it? His heart pounded as he swung his legs out of bed. His apartment was eerily silent. No traffic sounds from outside, no hum of the fridge, no distant murmur of neighbors. The silence pressed down on him, thick and unnatural. Then, just as he stood up, beep, beep, beep. A faint, distant ringing. His alarm. But it wasn't coming from his phone. Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat. The sound was muffled, distorted, like it was coming from another room. But that was impossible. He lived alone. He turned his head slowly, straining to listen. The beeping grew louder. Closer. His fingers tightened around his phone. He checked the screen again. Nothing. The alarm wasn't ringing. His phone was completely silent. Yet, the sound continued. Beep. 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 Ethan took a shaky step toward his bedroom door. The sound wasn't coming from the living room. It wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was coming from inside the walls. A chill ran down his spine. He pressed his ear against the wall. The beeping was right there. He yanked away, heart hammering. "I'm still half asleep," he muttered. "This isn't real. Just my mind playing tricks." He turned, heading toward the bathroom to splash cold water on his face. But as soon as he stepped inside, beep, beep, beep. He whipped around. The alarm was now in the bathroom. It was closer, louder. Ethan backed up, gripping the edge of the sink. His reflection stared back at him, wide-eyed and pale. Then the mirror flickered. Just for a second. A brief, static-like distortion, like a screen glitching out. His own reflection warped, twisting unnaturally before snapping back to normal. Ethan gasped, stumbling backward. The alarm stopped. Silence. Heavy. Oppressive. Then, beep, beep, beep. The sound was right behind him. Ethan spun around. There was no one there. But something had changed. His phone, still clutched in his shaking hand, vibrated. A new notification appeared on the screen. Alarm set, 6:30 a.m. But the time displayed was wrong. It wasn't 10:47 a.m. anymore. The screen now read 6:29 a.m., and the numbers were counting backward. Ethan's breath hitched. He stared at his phone, heart hammering against his ribs. 6:29 a.m. 6:28 a.m. The numbers ticked backward. "What the hell is going on?" he whispered. His fingers trembled as he tapped the screen, trying to turn off the alarm. The buttons wouldn't respond. The screen flickered, his reflection on the black glass distorting for just a moment before vanishing. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was right behind him again. He spun around, but the bathroom was empty. The mirror was normal. The room was exactly as it should be, except for the alarm, except for the time running backward. A cold sweat dripped down his back. He turned and bolted out of the bathroom, his bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. His apartment suddenly felt wrong. The air too still, the light too dim, as if the world had been drained of something vital. He grabbed his keys and yanked the front door open. The hallway outside stretched into darkness. Not the usual dim glow of apartment lights. No flickering bulbs. No emergency exit signs. Just pitch black nothing. Ethan stepped back, his stomach twisting. His hands shook as he reached for his phone again, the screen still stuck on the countdown. 6:27 a.m. 6:26 a.m. He needed to call someone. Anyone. He pressed his boss's number. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Then, click. Silence. Then a distorted, static-filled voice crackled through. "You're late, Ethan." His blood turned to ice. "Who is this?" he demanded. The voice on the other end was his own. "You should have woken up." The call disconnected. Beep, beep, beep. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath. The alarm was now coming from inside his phone. Not from the speaker. From the screen. A muffled, distant beeping, like it was trapped inside the glass. His fingers loosened, and the phone nearly slipped from his grip. He could hear his own breathing, too fast, too uneven. His vision blurred for a moment as dizziness overtook him. Then, his phone screen flashed. A new notification appeared. "Wake up." Ethan's chest tightened. His fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of what would happen if he tapped it. He didn't get the chance. The screen shattered. Not cracked, shattered. Like a mirror breaking from the inside out. Tiny shards of glass peeled away, floating in the air before vanishing into the darkness beyond the hallway. The phone still buzzed in his hand. The alarm still rang. And then, a whisper. Soft. "Close. You need to wake up, Ethan." His head snapped up. There was someone in his apartment. Ethan's chest seized with fear. His eyes darted around the dim apartment, scanning every shadow. The whisper had come from inside the room. But there was no one there. The alarm was still ringing. Loud. Deafening. But it wasn't coming from his broken phone anymore. It was everywhere. The walls. The ceiling. The floor. It pulsed inside his skull like a second heartbeat. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice cracking. The alarm stopped. Silence crushed down on him. Then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They came from his bedroom. Ethan's breath hitched. He turned his head slowly, barely daring to look. His bedroom door was slightly open. The darkness beyond it was thick, impenetrable. The kind of dark that didn't belong in a place with windows. Something shifted in the shadows. Ethan's stomach clenched. His instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of the apartment, to do anything but stand there frozen like prey. But his body refused to move. The door creaked open. A hand reached out. Pale. Bony. Fingers stretched too long. Then came the whisper again, his own voice. "You should have woken up." Ethan's body jolted into action. He stumbled backward, nearly tripping over himself as he rushed toward the front door. He grabbed the handle and yanked, locked. "No, no, no," he gasped, twisting the knob frantically. The footsteps behind him sped up. He slammed his fist against the door, heart pounding. He didn't care if he woke the neighbors. He had to get out. But then, his phone vibrated in his hand. A new notification. "Wake up." His vision blurred. The words seemed to twist, rearrange. His limbs felt heavy. His breath turned shallow. His knees buckled. The world around him tilted. And then, everything went black. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was lying in his bed. The room was quiet. Still. The early morning light filtered through his curtains, casting soft shadows across the floor. His chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. His mind reeled. Was it a dream? He swallowed hard and reached for his phone on the nightstand. His fingers trembled as he pressed the power button. 6:47 a.m. His stomach twisted. His alarm had never gone off. He sat up slowly, scanning the room. Everything looked normal. The door was slightly ajar, just as he had left it the night before. No strange figures. No whispers. His heart still pounded, but he forced himself to take deep breaths. Just a nightmare. Just a nightmare. His gaze drifted to his phone screen. A notification sat at the top. Alarm missed, 6:30 a.m. His stomach clenched. His hands went cold. The alarm had been set. It just never rang. He exhaled sharply and swung his legs over the side of the bed. He needed to shake this off. Get up. Move. Prove to himself that he was awake. But then, a sound. Faint. Distant. A soft, rhythmic beeping. Ethan froze. It was the alarm. Somewhere deep inside the apartment. Muffled, like it was behind a wall. Beneath the floor. Inside the air itself. And it was getting closer. He sucked in a sharp breath and stood up. His knees felt weak, but he forced himself to move. Slowly, carefully, he crept toward the bedroom door. His fingers hovered over the knob. The alarm grew louder. It was coming from the hallway. He pushed the door open and stepped out. The hallway stretched ahead, dim and shadowed. The beeping pulsed through the walls. It wasn't coming from his phone, nor from any device he owned. It was everywhere. Ethan's breath hitched. Then, at the end of the hallway, the shadows shifted. A figure stood there, still, silent, watching. Ethan's blood ran cold. The figure tilted its head, and then, in Ethan's own voice, it whispered, "You should have woken up." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His own voice. The figure had spoken in his own voice. His body refused to move. His mind screamed at him to run, to do something, but he was frozen in place, staring at the figure at the end of the hallway. It was shrouded in darkness, its form indistinct, shifting like a blur of static. The beeping grew louder. The sound drilled into his skull, pulsing like a second heartbeat. "You should have woken up," the figure said again. Ethan's legs finally obeyed him. He stumbled back into his bedroom and slammed the door shut. His hands scrambled to lock it, his fingers slick with sweat. Silence. The beeping had stopped. He pressed his ear against the door. No footsteps. No movement. Just stillness. His phone vibrated violently on the nightstand. He spun around and grabbed it. The screen was flooded with notifications. Alarm missed, 6:30 a.m. Alarm missed, 6:30 a.m. Alarm missed, 6:30 a.m. The same notification, over and over, filling the screen until it glitched and turned black. Then, a soft knock. Ethan's stomach twisted. Another knock. Louder. More insistent. He held his breath. "Ethan," a voice called from the hallway. His own voice. A sharp, high-pitched ring filled his ears. Not the beeping this time, something else. Something piercing. He dropped his phone and pressed his hands against his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. The noise dug into his skull like needles. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the bed. Then all at once, silence. His eyes flicked open. His room was normal. The phone lay motionless on the floor. The door was still shut. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the alarm went off. Beep, beep, beep. His phone screen lit up. 6:30 a.m. Ethan's blood turned to ice. "No," he whispered. The door creaked open. Something stepped inside. Ethan couldn't breathe. The door had been locked. He was sure of it. And yet, it creaked open, inch by inch, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. A shadow slid across the floor, stretching into his room like grasping fingers. He pushed himself back against the headboard, his pulse hammering in his ears. His body felt disconnected from him, like he was trapped in some nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The alarm continued its shrill, piercing beep. The sound was coming from everywhere now. Not just his phone. It was in the walls, in the ceiling, vibrating through his skull. A shape emerged in the doorway. At first, it was nothing but darkness, a vague outline of something not right. It shifted, blurred, like his eyes refused to fully understand what they were seeing. Then it stepped into the light. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was him. The same face. The same tired eyes. The same clothes. But the thing standing in front of him was wrong. Its skin was slightly off, too smooth, too waxy. Its lips curled into a smile that didn't belong on Ethan's face. A forced smile. Its eyes, though, they were the worst part. Too wide. Too empty. "You should have woken up," the thing said. The voice was his, but distorted, layered, as if something else was speaking beneath it. Ethan scrambled off the bed, his body finally obeying him. His back hit the wall. There was nowhere to go. The thing took a step closer. "I tried to wake you." It took another step. You didn't listen. Ethan grabbed his phone, his fingers shaking so hard he almost dropped it. The alarm was still flashing on the screen. 6:30 a.m. 6:30 a.m. 6:30 a.m. But that didn't make sense. It had been hours since he'd woken up. Hadn't it? The thing took another step. You missed it. Ethan couldn't think, couldn't breathe. Now I have to take your place. The lights in his room flickered. The beeping stopped. And then, the thing lunged. Ethan barely had time to react. The thing that wore his face lunged at him, its two wide grins stretching unnaturally, its hollow eyes locked onto his. He threw himself to the side, hitting the floor hard. Pain shot up his arm, but he ignored it, scrambling away as fast as he could. His heart was pounding so violently it hurt. The room felt wrong. The air had thickened, pressing against his skin, making every movement sluggish, like he was trying to run through deep water. He turned. The thing was already standing. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't stumbled. It just stood there, staring, smiling. "You can't run," it said. Ethan's breath came in ragged gasps. His phone, he still had it. His fingers fumbled over the screen, trying to dial. Who? The police? A friend? His parents? His hands were shaking too hard to focus. The alarm blinked again. 6:30 a.m. 6:30 a.m. 6:30 a.m. The beeping started up once more, but it was different now. Lower, slower, like something was dragging the sound through molasses. Beep, beep, beep. Ethan clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside him. He squeezed his eyes shut. "Wake up," he whispered. "Wake up, wake up, wake up." Something cold brushed his arm. His eyes snapped open. The thing was inches away now, crouched beside him, its too perfect face leaning close. "I already did," it whispered. Ethan screamed. Darkness rushed in. Ethan's scream cut off as everything vanished into silence. The room was gone. The air, the floor, the walls, everything. He was floating in nothingness. A vast, endless void. No sound. No light. Just the distant, faint ringing. Beep. 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 It was far away, but moving closer. Crawling through the empty dark. Ethan tried to move, but there was no ground to push against. No gravity to hold him. Just an overwhelming sense of falling in place. Then a voice. His voice. "You slept too long." He turned, or maybe he didn't, but suddenly the thing was there. Grinning. Watching. Waiting. What is this?" Ethan whispered. His own voice sounded weak, distant. The thing tilted its head. "Your alarm went off." The ringing grew louder. Beep. 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 Ethan clutched his head, panic rising. "I don't understand. Why am I here?" The thing's grin widened. "Because you didn't wake up." And then, the void cracked. A jagged, splintering tear split through the darkness, revealing something beyond. His bedroom. He could see it. His bed, the clock, the soft glow of morning light leaking through the curtains. "I can go back," Ethan breathed. The thing laughed. "Are you sure that's your room?" His stomach dropped, because something was wrong. The walls weren't quite right. The shadows in the corners stretched in unnatural angles. The air inside the room shifted, moving too fast, like something was waiting for him to step through. "Wake up, Ethan," the thing said. The ringing blared now, shaking the empty space. Beep, beep, beep. The tear widened. Ethan had no choice. He lunged through. Ethan hit the floor hard. His hands scraped against the rough wood, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The ringing had stopped. Silence. He was back, in his room. The alarm clock sat on his nightstand, its red numbers blinking 12 o'clock over and over again. Ethan swallowed, pushing himself up. His bed was there. The window. His desk. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. Something was off. The air was too still. The walls too quiet. Then he noticed something. The door. It was slightly open, just enough to see into the hallway. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the eye staring at him through the gap. Wide, unblinking, watching. Ethan's stomach twisted. His body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. The eye didn't blink. It didn't shift. It just watched. Then a whisper. "You didn't wake up." Ethan bolted. He ran for the door, grabbed the handle, and slammed it shut. His chest heaved. His heart pounded. Silence again. Then knocking. Soft at first. Then harder. Knock. 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 Ethan backed away. He glanced at the clock. Still blinking. 12 o'clock. His phone. He grabbed it, hands shaking, and hit the power button. Nothing. Dead. The knocking stopped. Ethan held his breath. Then his voice. From the other side of the door. "Ethan, open up. It's time to wake up." His own voice. Whispering. Ethan's blood ran cold. He wasn't alone. Ethan's breath hitched. His voice, but not him. "Open the door, Ethan." "No. No, no, no." He backed away, gripping his phone, his fingers pressing the power button again. Still dead. The door handle twisted. Slow. Deliberate. Ethan lunged forward, pressing his weight against the door. Silence. Then a whisper. Right at the crack of the door. "You can't sleep forever." A shiver crawled down Ethan's spine. The air in the room felt heavy, pressing against his skin. His ears buzzed with static, like an old television set stuck between channels. And then, the ringing. Faint. Distant. But getting closer. Ethan staggered back. His eyes darted around the room. Where was it coming from? The walls? The window? No. The closet. The ringing was inside the closet. Ethan's stomach twisted into knots. He took a step toward it, then froze. The door was already open. Not much. Just an inch. Just enough for the darkness inside to breathe. Re-thering. Louder. Ethan's knees almost buckled. His body screamed run, but he couldn't. He had to see. He had to know. He reached out. His fingers trembled as they brushed the closet door. He took a deep breath and pulled it open. Darkness. Cold. And at the very back, the alarm clock. The same one from his nightstand. Its red numbers flickered. 12 o'clock. The ringing grew deafening. Ethan's skin prickled. Then, from inside the closet, a hand shot out. Pale. Bony. Fingers too long. It grabbed his wrist. Ice-cold skin. Too strong. Too real. Ethan screamed. He tried to pull away, but the grip tightened. The numbers on the alarm clock changed. 11:59. The ringing stopped. And the voice, the whisper that had been outside his door. It was inside the closet now, right by his ear. "Time to wake up." Ethan yanked his arm, but the grip was like iron. The fingers dug into his skin, ice cold, unmoving. "Time to wake up," the whisper repeated, closer now. Right behind him, Ethan's breath hitched. His body locked in place. Then, the alarm rang again. Re-thirithing. The sound rattled in his skull, piercing, unnatural. Ethan's vision blurred. His thoughts fractured. The numbers on the alarm clock flashed faster. 11:58, 11:57, 11:56. The hand in the closet tightened its grip. No, this wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Ethan clenched his teeth and threw his weight back. The force ripped him free. He stumbled away, clutching his wrist. The skin burned where it had touched him. The closet door slammed shut. The ringing stopped. Ethan stood there, panting, staring at the door. Silence. Then, knocking. From inside the closet. Soft at first. Then harder. The door shuttered. Ethan bolted. He threw open his bedroom door, racing down the hall. The moment his feet hit the living room floor, the ringing started again. But not from the closet. From the kitchen. Ethan froze. The ringing echoed in the small apartment. His legs trembled as he turned toward the sound. There, on the kitchen counter, the alarm clock, the same one. The red numbers blinked. 11:45. It's getting earlier, Ethan whispered. He had to stop it. He had to end this. Ethan rushed forward, his shaking hands reaching for the clock. The moment his fingers touched it, the ringing stopped. Silence. But before he could breathe, the lights flickered. The air turned heavy. And then, behind him, a chair scraped against the floor. Ethan spun around. No one was there. The room stretched. The walls darkened. And a whisper, low, cold, inhuman, right at his ear. You should have woken up. Ethan screamed. Ethan whipped around, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The kitchen felt wrong. The air was too thick. The walls seemed closer. The alarm clock sat silent on the counter, but its numbers continued to blink. 11:30. His stomach turned. It was still counting down. You should have woken up. The whisper echoed in his skull. His hands clawed at his ears, but the voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside his head. Ethan backed away, his feet unsteady. Then, the alarm rang again. Louder. The walls shook. The floor trembled. Ethan staggered, gripping the counter for balance. Re-thirithing. The sound drilled into his skull. His knees buckled. Then the lights went out. Total darkness. Re-thirithing. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. Wake up, the voice whispered. His chest heaved. No, this isn't real. Then, silence. Ethan opened his eyes. The kitchen was gone. He stood in his bedroom. His bed. His desk. His alarm clock, back where it should be. The red numbers glowed softly. 7 a.m. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. A dream? No. It felt too real. He touched his wrist, where the cold fingers had grabbed him. The skin was tender, bruised. His breath shook. Then, a sound. Faint. Distant. An alarm. Coming from outside. Ethan's fingers curled into his sheets. The ringing was getting closer. Ethan sat frozen in his bed. The alarm was still ringing. Faint. Distant. But moving closer. His stomach twisted as he strained to hear. The sound was outside his apartment. No, it was in the hallway. The walls felt too thin. The ringing pressed against them, vibrating the air. Ethan's breath caught. His hands trembled as he reached for his phone. No service. His pulse pounded in his ears. Re-thirithing. It was right outside his door. He stared at the handle, waiting, dreading. Would it turn? The ringing stopped. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Ethan's skin prickled. He wasn't alone. There was something on the other side, waiting. He swallowed hard, then forced himself to stand. Each step toward the door felt wrong, like he was walking toward something he should never see. His hand hovered over the knob. Then, a whisper. You should have woken up. Ethan yanked his hand back. His breath hitched. Something scratched at the door. Slow, deliberate. His whole body locked up. Then, the alarm exploded through the silence, louder than before. The walls shook. The floor rumbled beneath his feet. Ethan stumbled back, heart hammering. The door bulged inward, like something was trying to force its way through. He scrambled to his desk, grabbing the heaviest thing he could find, a lamp. The walls groaned. Then, the door swung open, and the ringing stopped. The hallway was empty, but the air was wrong. It smelled stale, like an old, forgotten room. Ethan's chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. Then he saw it, on the floor just beyond the doorway. An alarm clock, identical to his own. Its red numbers blinked. 7:01 a.m. Ethan's blood ran cold. The alarm clock sat in the doorway, its red numbers pulsing like a heartbeat. 7:01 a.m. But that wasn't possible. His real alarm clock was still on his nightstand. He turned. There it was, silent, unmoving. But the one in the doorway, it had followed him. His breath hitched. Was it watching him? No, that was crazy. It was just a clock, but something about it felt alive. The screen flickered. The numbers shifted. 6:59 a.m. Ethan's stomach twisted. The time was going backward. He took a step back. His heel hit the bed. The moment his foot touched the floor again. Rithing. The alarm screamed through the apartment. Ethan flinched. The clock in the doorway shook, rattling against the floor. Then, it moved. Not slid. Not tipped over. It dragged itself forward, like it was crawling. Ethan's throat locked up. He couldn't move. The alarm was deafening. The walls shuddered. The ceiling groaned. And the clock inched closer. The screen blinked again. 6:58 a.m. The sound warped. It was no longer an alarm. It was a voice. A garbled, crackling whisper beneath the ringing. "Wake up!" Ethan's chest tightened. "You should have woken up." He lurched backward, slamming into his desk. The lamp toppled over. 6:57 a.m. The clock dragged itself again. Closer. Ethan's fingers grasped the lamp. His heart pounded. The ringing was inside his skull now. The walls rippled like heat waves. He had to do something. He had to. 6:56 a.m. Then the lights flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, he saw something standing behind the clock. Tall, thin, watching. The lights flashed back on. The figure was gone, but the clock was even closer. 6:55 a.m. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged gasps. Then, the door slammed shut on its own. He was trapped, and the alarm was still getting closer. Ethan's mind raced. He had to stop this. He had to make it stop. The clock sat just a few feet away now, its red numbers burning into his eyes. 6:54 a.m. He gripped the lamp tighter. His knuckles turned white. Ethan said, "You're just a stupid clock. You're not real." The alarm warped again. The ringing turned into something wet, like static drowning in water. "Wake up!" Ethan swung the lamp. It smashed into the clock. Glass shattered. Sparks flared. The alarm stuttered, then cut off. Silence. The room felt wrong, like the air had been sucked away. Ethan's ears rang from the aftermath. His chest heaved. He stared at the broken clock. The pieces twitched on the floor, small crackling pops sparking from the destroyed face. Then, the lamp in his hand flickered. His phone, his laptop, even the alarm clock on his nightstand. All their screens blinked. Then they all displayed the same thing. 6:53 a.m. Ethan's stomach dropped. The broken clock on the floor let out a low, distorted buzz. Then, the alarm screamed again. It blasted through the room, the sheer force knocking Ethan off his feet. His back hit the desk. He groaned, vision blurring. The walls shifted. They stretched. His bed, his furniture, everything around him distorted, like the room itself was bending into something wrong. And the alarm, it wasn't coming from the clock anymore. It was coming from inside the walls. The sound pulsed, throbbed, grew. Ethan pressed his hands against his ears, but it did nothing. Then he saw it. The broken clock was gone, and something stood in its place. Tall, shadowed, hollow. Its face. It wasn't a face. It was a clock with glowing red numbers. 6:52 a.m. And the hands were ticking backward. Ethan's pulse slammed against his ribs. The figure stepped forward. Its limbs twitched. The ticking was in his head now, syncing with his own heartbeat. Tick, tick, tick. Ethan scrambled backward. "Wake up!" The voice slithered through the noise. The figure lifted its hand. Its fingers, clock hands, sharpened into jagged points. Then, it lunged. Ethan threw himself to the side. The creature's sharp, jagged fingers slashed through the air where he had been. The alarm screeched louder. The room warped. The walls twisted and pulsed like they were breathing. Ethan crawled backward, his hands scraping against the warped wooden floor. The figure turned, its clock face head flickering like a broken screen. The numbers on it glowed red. 6:51 a.m. And the numbers were still ticking down. "Wake up!" The voice vibrated inside Ethan's skull. "You're late, Ethan." The creature lurched forward. Ethan scrambled to his feet and ran. He bolted toward the door, hands shaking as he grabbed the knob. Locked. No. No, no, no. He twisted it harder, but it wouldn't budge. Behind him, the ticking grew louder. The figure moved closer, its long, skeletal arms twitching unnaturally. Ethan's breath came fast. His heart slammed in his chest. His fingers clawed at the lock. He yanked. He pulled. But the door wouldn't open. "Wake up!" Ethan's head pounded. His vision blurred. The walls shifted again. His bed folded inward like melting wax. His desk sank into the floor. Reality itself was falling apart. And the clock-faced creature, it was right behind him. 6:50 a.m. The red numbers burned into his vision. The alarm warped again, a shrieking sound that no longer resembled anything mechanical. It sounded alive. "You're late, Ethan," the voice whispered right next to his ear. A cold hand clamped onto his shoulder. Ethan screamed. He spun around, swinging his fist. But his hand passed straight through the creature, like it was made of smoke. Yet the grip on his shoulder was solid, cold, unrelenting. "Wake up!" The numbers on its face flashed violently. Ethan's vision darkened. His knees buckled. The ticking, the ringing, the voice. It was inside him now. And the last thing he saw was the clock hitting 6:49 a.m. Everything went black. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was in his bed. Morning light filtered through the curtains. The air felt still, too still. His body was drenched in sweat. His heart pounded. He turned his head to check the time. His alarm clock sat on the nightstand. 6:48 a.m. His breath hitched. That wasn't right. He had just seen the clock count down to 6:49. The numbers should be lower. But they weren't. They had reset. Ethan sat up, hands trembling. He reached for the alarm clock, and the moment his fingers touched it, the ringing started again. Faint, distant, but getting closer. A chill slid down his spine. No, 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 no. He shoved the clock off the nightstand. It hit the floor with a dull thud. The ringing didn't stop. It only grew louder. Ethan swung his legs over the bed and stood. The walls looked normal. The furniture was solid. But the ringing, it was coming from outside his room. Ethan's hands shook as he reached for the door handle. He hesitated. Then slowly he turned the knob. The door creaked open. The hallway was dim. The ringing, it was closer. Ethan stepped forward, barefoot on the cold wooden floor. The air felt heavy, like something was waiting. He turned the corner and froze. The clock-faced creature stood at the end of the hall. Still, silent, watching. 6:47 a.m. The numbers on its face glowed red. Ethan couldn't breathe. His pulse roared in his ears. The ringing spiked into a high-pitched wail. And then, the creature moved. Ethan stumbled backward. The creature lurched forward. Its steps were slow but deliberate. The glowing red numbers on its face flickered. 6:46 a.m. The ringing was deafening now. Ethan's hands flew to his ears. "No, no, no," he whispered. The creature took another step. Ethan could finally see it clearly. Its body was tall and thin, draped in something that looked like tattered cloth. But its face was nothing but a clock. A giant, round alarm clock. The red numbers glowed brighter. The minute hand twitched. 6:45 a.m. Ethan's stomach dropped. The time was going backward. The thing was rewinding him. No, no, I have to wake up. I have to wake up. His fingernails dug into his palms. The ringing vibrated through his skull. The creature stepped closer. Ethan turned and ran. His feet pounded against the wooden floor. He reached the living room and stopped. Every clock in the house was spinning backward. The wall clock, the microwave, the stove. The numbers raced down the hours, the minutes, the seconds. He was losing time. The creature was right behind him. Ethan bolted for the front door. He grabbed the handle, and it wouldn't turn. Come on, come on. He yanked. The door stayed shut. He could hear the creature's breathing now, a hollow mechanical wheeze. Ethan spun around. The creature was right there. It lifted one bony hand and placed 2 fingers against his forehead. A sudden, sharp pulse shot through Ethan's skull. His vision blurred. His limbs went limp. The ringing overwhelmed him. And then, everything went dark. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was in his bed. The room was dim. His heart was pounding. He sat up, gasping. He could still hear the alarm. Faint. Distant. He turned to his phone. 6:45 a.m. No, he whispered. He grabbed the device. The alarm was set for 6 a.m., but it had never gone off. The ringing grew louder. Ethan threw back the covers. He ran to the window. Outside, the world was still. Too still. No cars. No people. Just a thick, heavy silence. Except for the ringing. It was coming from down the hall. Ethan's breath shook. He turned toward his bedroom door. He did not want to open it, but his legs moved anyway. Slow, cautious steps. He reached for the handle. His fingers trembled. The ringing was right there, behind the door. He took a deep breath and opened it. The hallway was dark. Shadows stretched long and twisted. The ringing echoed through the walls. It was coming from the end of the hallway, the guest room. Ethan's stomach tightened. That door was closed. It was never closed. He took a step forward. The floor creaked. The ringing wavered. Like it hurt him. Ethan swallowed hard. His hands were clammy. Another step. Another. He reached the guest room door. The ringing was screaming now. His ears throbbed. His vision blurred. Ethan reached for the doorknob. His fingers closed around it. It was cold. Ice cold. His breath came in shaky gasps. Just open it. Just look. He turned the handle and pushed. The door creaked open. The room was pitch black, but in the center, a glowing red light, flickering, shifting. A clock, sitting on the desk, the old alarm clock from his childhood. Ethan's knees nearly buckled. That's not possible. It had been thrown away years ago. Yet here it was, ringing, calling, waiting. The hands on its face were spinning. Backward. Ethan stepped closer. The numbers blurred. They slowed. 6:44 a.m. His vision swam. The walls tilted. The ringing pierced his skull. And then, the alarm stopped. The room plunged into silence. Ethan's breath hitched. His pulse pounded. Then, in the silence, a soft mechanical click. The sound of a clock hand moving. And from the darkness, a voice. You're running out of time, Ethan. Ethan's body locked up. That voice, it was his own, whispering from the darkness. You're running out of time. His throat tightened. His legs shook. He wanted to run, but he couldn't move. The clock on the desk glowed brighter. A deep, red pulse, like a heartbeat. The hands spun faster. The numbers blurred. Ethan forced his foot forward. One step. Another. The floor felt wrong. Soft. Uneven. Like he was sinking. He reached the clock. His fingers trembled. Stop it, he whispered. Please just stop. The ringing started again. But now, it was inside his skull, echoing through his bones. He clutched his head. His knees buckled. Make it stop. Please. The red light flashed. A violent, searing pulse. Then, everything vanished. The sound, the light, the clock. The room collapsed into blackness, and Ethan was falling, spinning, screaming. Then, silence, and suddenly, his eyes snapped open. He was in his bed. His room was dim. His heart was pounding. His phone buzzed. Ethan grabbed it. The screen read, 6 a.m., and his alarm was going off, a high shrill ringing. But this time, it wasn't just in his ears. It was in the walls, the floor, the air, a deafening, distorted screech. Ethan clutched his chest. His vision blurred. He gasped for air. Then, a single sharp click, like a clock hand moving, and a whisper in his ear. "You're too late." Ethan froze. The whisper had come from right beside him. His breath shuddered. He turned his head, and his stomach dropped. There, in the darkness, a figure sat on the edge of his bed, still, silent, barely visible in the dim glow of the alarm clock. But Ethan recognized it instantly, because it was him. The same face, the same clothes, but the eyes, hollow, sunken, a deep, endless black. "You're too late," it whispered again. Its voice was his own, but twisted, wrong. Ethan tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. He was trapped, frozen in his own skin. The figure leaned closer. Its breath was cold. It smelled like dust, like something long forgotten. "You should have listened," it said. Its lips didn't move, but the words echoed inside Ethan's skull. The alarm was still ringing, louder, shriller. It drilled into his bones. The clock on the desk flickered. The numbers were wrong, scrambled, unreadable. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure tilted its head, and then it smiled, a slow, unnatural stretch, its lips pulling back too far. Its teeth were sharp, jagged, and Ethan finally understood. The ringing wasn't a warning. It was a countdown, and his time was up. The alarm screamed, a sharp, shrill wail, piercing, deafening. Ethan clenched his teeth. His head felt like it was splitting open. The figure, his double, began to change. Its face twisted, its skin darkened, the hollow eyes widened. "Time's up," it whispered. And then, it lunged. Ethan felt it, cold, claw-like hands gripping his shoulders. A force pulling him down. The room spun. The walls melted away. And suddenly, he was falling into darkness, into a place where the alarm never stopped, where time had no meaning, where he would be trapped forever. The last thing he saw, before the blackness swallowed him whole, was his bedroom, perfectly still, perfectly quiet, and in it, lying in bed, was his body, motionless, unmoving. The alarm clock blinked once, then flickered out. The ringing stopped, and Ethan was forgotten. Let's start with the next story. Emma found the package on her doorstep just as the sun was beginning to set. A small, plain box wrapped in brown paper with no return address. She hesitated before picking it up. It was light, almost weightless. "Weird," she murmured. There was no knock, no doorbell. She hadn't ordered anything. She stepped inside, placed it on the kitchen counter, and carefully peeled away the wrapping. Inside was a jewelry box. Her heart skipped. She knew this box. She had seen it before, in a store window months ago. A beautifully carved, antique-style box, dark wood with delicate gold inlay. She had admired it but never bought it. Inside the lid, a small mirror gleamed. A tiny ballerina figure stood frozen in the center, waiting to dance. It was exactly the one she had wanted. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Soft music whispered out, a slow, eerie tune. Something was off about it. She glanced inside and saw a folded note. She unfolded it carefully. In neat, black ink, the words were written. "You owe me." Emma's breath caught. Her eyes darted back to the box. It sat there, innocent and beautiful. But suddenly, she didn't want to touch it anymore. Emma stared at the note, her hands growing cold. "You owe me. Who sent this? What did it mean?" Her mind raced, trying to remember if she had borrowed money or forgotten a favor. Nothing came to mind. The jewelry box sat open on the counter, its tiny ballerina still spinning slowly. The soft, delicate music filled the room. Then click. The ballerina stopped. The music cut off. Emma's breath hitched. She hadn't touched it. A strange feeling crawled down her spine. Slowly, she reached out and shut the lid. The house fell silent. She pushed the box away. Maybe it's just a prank, she muttered. She grabbed her phone and texted her closest friends. Emma, did one of you send me a gift? A music box? Minutes passed. One by one, the replies came in. Lena, nope. What kind of box? David, not me. Jess, oh, that's creepy. A chill crept into her bones. She looked at the box again. Something about it felt wrong. She turned it over, looking for anything unusual. At the bottom, in small, scratched letters, were 3 more words. Return the favor. Emma dropped it. The box hit the counter with a thud. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to throw it away, but something in her gut told her that wouldn't be a good idea. Instead, she shoved it into a drawer and slammed it shut. She would forget about it, or at least she would try. That night, Emma tossed and turned in bed. The words on the note burned in her mind. You owe me. Return the favor. She had tried to forget about it, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. Then, in the silence of her bedroom, she heard it. A faint melody. Her breath hitched. The music was coming from the drawer. The music box was playing on its own. Emma sat up, her heart hammering. No, she whispered. The lid was closed. It shouldn't be playing. She forced herself out of bed, her bare feet pressing into the cold floor. Slowly, she crossed the room and reached for the drawer. Her fingers trembled as she pulled it open. The music stopped. The box sat there, just as she had left it. She exhaled sharply and grabbed it, turning it over in her hands. Maybe it had a faulty mechanism. Maybe she had imagined it. With a deep breath, she set it back down and closed the drawer again. Just sleep, she told herself. She climbed back into bed, pulling the covers over her shoulders. She had barely shut her eyes when, click, the drawer slid open on its own. Emma's entire body stiffened. Her eyes darted toward it. The drawer was open. The music box sat inside, perfectly still. And yet, the ballerina was spinning. A sick feeling twisted in her stomach. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Then, as she stared, she saw something else. A shadow. It flickered just behind the box, shifting in the darkness. Not the shadow of an object. Not her own shadow. Something else. Something watching her. Emma grabbed the drawer and shoved it shut. The music stopped instantly. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. She didn't dare move. She lay there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and she drifted into a restless sleep. But as she slept, she dreamt of a voice. A whisper. You owe me. The next morning, Emma woke up with a pounding headache. The dream, if it had even been a dream, still clung to her mind like a thick fog. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples. Her eyes drifted toward the drawer. It was still shut. For a moment, she thought about opening it, checking if the music box was still inside. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. Instead, she forced herself out of bed and into the kitchen. She needed coffee. Something normal. Something real. The rich aroma filled the air as she poured herself a cup, but her hands were unsteady. She kept thinking about that voice. You owe me. Return the favor. She took a slow sip, trying to shake the feeling, when suddenly, ding dong. Her head snapped toward the front door. She wasn't expecting anyone. Heart pounding, she set down her coffee and hesitantly walked to the door. She peered through the peephole. No one was there. A chill ran down her spine. She swallowed hard and unlocked the door, pulling it open just enough to peek outside. Nothing. Only the quiet morning air. She exhaled, shaking her head. I'm losing it, she muttered. But then, she saw it. A small package, sitting neatly on her doorstep. Her stomach twisted as she bent down to pick it up. There was no return address, no name, just a small, folded note taped to the top. Emma's fingers trembled as she peeled it off and unfolded the paper. One sentence was scrawled in the same handwriting as before. A debt must always be paid. Her breath hitched. She didn't want to open the box, but some force, some horrible curiosity compelled her to. Slowly, she peeled away the wrapping and lifted the lid. Inside was something that made her blood run cold. It was a photograph of her, taken from inside her apartment. Her mouth went dry. The picture was recent, too recent. She was standing in her living room, holding the first package. She spun around, eyes darting to every corner of the room. Was someone here, watching her? She backed away from the door, clutching the note in one hand, the box in the other. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Then, the music box started playing. From inside her bedroom, Emma let out a shaky breath. She wasn't alone. She was never alone. Emma's entire body tensed. The music box was playing, but she hadn't touched it. The haunting melody drifted through the air, slow and deliberate. Each note sent a fresh wave of terror rippling through her. She took a step back, clutching the photograph to her chest. Her breath came fast and shallow. No, 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 no. She turned sharply, scanning the apartment. The walls felt too close, the shadows too deep. Someone had been here. Someone was still here. A sharp creak sounded from the bedroom. Emma's stomach dropped. She had to leave. Now. But her feet wouldn't move. The music continued, the soft chime of the notes filling the silence, growing louder. Then, a whisper, right behind her. Emma. Her breath hitched. She spun around. No one. But the air felt wrong. Heavy. Thick. She could hear her own heartbeat, deafening in her ears. This isn't real, she whispered. It's in my head. But then, something else moved. The bedroom door creaked open slowly, as if inviting her in. A shudder ran through her spine. She needed to leave. Run. Get out. Call someone. But her feet carried her forward instead. Her hands shook as she reached for the doorframe. The music box sat on the dresser, its lid open, the delicate ballerina spinning in slow, eerie circles. The melody played on, but something was wrong. The notes were warping, shifting into something distorted, something not human. Then, a new note appeared beside the music box. It hadn't been there before. Emma's fingers trembled as she picked it up. The handwriting was the same as before, those sharp, uneven letters. But this time, the message was different. You can't ignore a debt forever. Her pulse spiked. A sudden rush of cold air brushed against her neck, and in the mirror, she saw it. A shadow, tall, watching, standing right behind her. Emma's scream caught in her throat. She turned, but there was nothing there, only the empty room. The music box slowed and stopped. Silence. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She grabbed the music box, slammed the lid shut, and backed away. Ding. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. With shaking hands, she pulled it out. A new message. Unknown number. Time's up. Her vision blurred. She stumbled backward, her legs weak. The air felt too thick to breathe. Then she heard it. A knock at the door. 3 slow taps. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Emma froze. The knocks were slow, deliberate. Waiting. She clutched her phone, her fingers slick with sweat. Her mind screamed at her not to open the door. But another part of her, the part gripped by a terrifying curiosity, knew she had no choice. Because whoever was outside wouldn't leave. Her breath trembled as she took slow, careful steps toward the door. The apartment felt smaller, colder, suffocating. She reached for the peephole. Her hands shook as she pressed her eye against it. Her stomach dropped. No one was there. Only the dimly lit hallway beyond her apartment. Empty. Silent. Emma pulled back. Her heart pounded so hard it echoed in her ears. Then, another knock. Her breath hitched. 3 taps. But this time, it didn't come from the front door. It came from inside the apartment. Emma spun around so fast she nearly lost her balance. The knock had come from the bedroom. From inside the closet, her breath came in shallow gasps. She stared at the closet door, her mind racing. No, 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 no. Her body begged her to run, to get out, to leave everything behind. But her feet wouldn't move, because the closet door was opening, inch by inch, slow, methodical. A cold gust of air rushed out, the same scent from before, dust, decay, something old and rotting. Emma's knees nearly buckled. The door stood open now. Inside, only darkness. A deep, endless blackness that shouldn't be possible in her small apartment. Then, something moved inside it. A whisper slithered through the silence. "You owe me." Emma choked on a scream. The darkness inside the closet shifted. A shape began to emerge, tall, thin, long. A hand reached out. Long fingers. Too many joints. The nails were splintered and sharp. It reached for her. Emma stumbled back, her body screaming to move. But the air was too thick, pressing in on her chest like invisible hands. The shadow stepped closer, unfolding itself from the darkness. It had no face, only a smooth, empty void where a face should be. But she could feel it watching her. It knew her. It had been waiting. Emma tried to scream, but no sound came. The thing tilted its head. It raised one skeletal hand and pointed at her. The whisper returned, curling around her ears like a breath of frozen wind. "You can't run." The lights in her apartment flickered violently. Then, they went out. Pitch black. A silence so deep it swallowed everything. And then, a final whisper, right at her ear. "Time's up, Emma." The last thing she felt was the cold grip of fingers closing around her throat. Emma kicked and thrashed, her hands clawing at the ice-cold fingers wrapped around her throat. But there was nothing there. Her body convulsed as she gasped for air, her chest burning, her vision spotting with black. Then, the grip vanished. Emma fell to the floor, coughing, choking on breath after breath. The room around her swam, her lungs heaving. The lights flickered back on. Her apartment was silent. Still, the closet door stood open, but it was empty. Emma's entire body trembled as she pushed herself up. No, I didn't imagine that. Her throat throbbed. She stumbled to the bathroom, nearly collapsing against the sink. With shaking hands, she turned on the light and gasped. Dark, bruising finger marks wrapped around her neck. Her stomach lurched. She backed away, her breath coming in rapid, shallow gasps. The mirror reflected her pale, wide-eyed face, and something else. A slip of paper, sitting neatly on the bathroom counter. Emma turned slowly. It hadn't been there before. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The paper felt old, rough against her fingertips. The edges were burned, like it had been plucked from a fire. A single sentence was written in ink that looked far too dark. "You owe me." Emma dropped it. Her mind raced. She had to get out. Now. She spun toward the door, and the lights went out again. A whisper slithered through the darkness. "Nowhere to run, Emma." Her blood turned to ice. A cold breath brushed the back of her neck. Something was right behind her. She lunged for the door, her hands scrambling for the handle. But the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. No, not locked. Something was holding it shut. A soft laugh echoed in the pitch black. Emma screamed. Then, everything went silent. The silence was worse than the whispers, worse than the hands that had wrapped around her throat. Emma pressed herself against the door, her chest heaving, her fingers clawing at the wood. The air around her was thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Then, tap, tap, tap. The sound came from behind her. Emma didn't want to turn. She knew she shouldn't. But something made her. Her body moved on its own, slow and stiff, like she was trapped in a nightmare. The bathroom mirror stood in front of her, reflecting the pitch-black room behind her. But she wasn't alone. A figure stood in the reflection. Tall, twisted, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its limbs too long, stretching toward her. But when Emma looked behind her, there was nothing there. Her stomach twisted. She looked back at the mirror. The figure was closer. She tried to move. She couldn't. Her body was frozen, locked in place. The figure in the mirror lifted a hand, long fingers stretching toward the glass. Emma wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't breathe. The hand pressed against the glass. And then, it pushed through. The surface of the mirror rippled like water as the thing reached for her. Emma snapped out of it. She stumbled back, her heel hitting the counter. Her hand scrambled for something, anything, to defend herself. Her fingers closed around a heavy glass bottle. She didn't think. She swung. The mirror shattered. Glass exploded outward, raining over the sink, the counter, the floor. The reflection was gone. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears. She didn't wait. She ran. Her hands wrenched at the bathroom door. This time it opened. She stumbled into the hallway, nearly tripping over herself. She had to get out of the apartment, out of the building. She bolted for the front door, her hands fumbling with the locks. Her breath hitched. The door wouldn't open. A whisper slid through the darkness behind her. "You can't leave, Emma." The note lay on the floor. It had changed. A new message was scrawled beneath the first. "You owe me, and now it's time to pay." Emma screamed. The lights went out. The darkness swallowed Emma whole. She spun, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The apartment stretched around her, vast and empty, yet it felt crowded, as if something unseen pressed against her from all sides. A whisper slithered through the air. "It's time, Emma." Her skin prickled. No, she wasn't going to let this thing take her. She turned, running blindly into the living room. Her hands slammed against the walls, searching, feeling, for something, anything she could use. Then, her fingers brushed against the box. The gift, the thing that had started all of this. Emma hesitated for only a second. Then she grabbed it, yanked off the lid, and stared into its depths. Inside, there was nothing, just an empty black void, a darkness that felt alive. The air around her thickened, twisting. The voice came again, this time right behind her ear. "You took the gift. Now you are mine." "No." Emma squeezed her eyes shut. This wasn't real. It wasn't real. She sucked in a breath, forced herself to focus. The note. The gift. The moment she opened it, this thing had been inside it all along. And if it came from the box. Emma's hands trembled, but she tightened her grip. With everything she had left, she threw the box into the darkness. For a moment there was silence. Then, a scream. A voice not hers howled in rage. The air rippled, like reality itself had been disturbed. The shadows around her twisted, stretching toward the box as if being pulled inside. Emma didn't stay to watch. She ran. This time, when she reached the front door, it opened. She stumbled into the hallway, heart hammering, lungs burning. The moment she crossed the threshold, a gust of air rushed past her, slamming the door shut behind her. The whispering stopped. The apartment fell silent. For a long time, Emma just stood there, staring at the door. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the note. The words had vanished. All that remained was a single line, scrawled in shaky handwriting. A gift must always be returned. Emma let the paper slip from her fingers. She didn't look back. She walked away, her shadow stretching long behind her, and the door just barely creaked open once more. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.